1999. Fall asleep to Hilarious History, The Edge of the Zeros, by Mark Twain. Copyright 2026. James Henderson. Chapter 1. The Millennium Bug's Shadow. I have lived through a fair share of transitions, most of them involving a change of socks or a change of scenery. But I have never seen a civilization quite so determined to frighten itself out of its wits as the one inhabiting the tail end of the year 1899, or, as the modern inhabitants insist on calling it, 1999. When I was a boy on the Mississippi, the turn of a century was a dignified affair. We expected the world to carry on much as it had, perhaps with a bit more steam and a few fewer mosquitoes. But the humans of 1999 have managed to invent a brand of terror that is uniquely, impressively stupid. They have surrendered their collective sanity to a creature they call the Millennium Bug, a beast that possesses neither wings nor stingers, but consists entirely of 2 missing digits and a catastrophic lack of foresight. The premise, as I understand it from the frantic shouting on the evening news, is this. For decades, the high priests of the silicon chip, the programmers, a dour race of men who live on caffeine and the glow of cathode tubes, decided to save space by recording years as 2 digits. To a computer, the year 1999 is simply 99. This was a marvelous efficiency until someone realized that when the clock strikes midnight on December 31st, the machines will look at 00 and conclude they have been transported back to the year 1900. Now, you might think a machine would be happy to have its youth restored. I know several steamboat captains who would have given their left leg to be 20 again. But apparently, a computer is a literal-minded sort of idiot. If it thinks it is 1900, it will supposedly decide that interest rates haven't been calculated yet, that airplanes haven't been invented, and that the modern power grid is a physical impossibility. The bug is expected to send the world's elevators plunging into basements, cause nuclear missiles to launch themselves out of pure chronological confusion, and, most tragically of all, make the automated grocery store doors refuse to open for a man seeking a loaf of bread. I have spent the better part of January watching my neighbors prepare for this digital judgment day, and I must say the spectacle is the finest comedy I have seen since the invention of the Congress. There is a specific kind of madness that takes hold of a man when he believes his toaster is plotting against him. I walked down the street yesterday and saw a fellow, a banker by trade, a man who usually carries himself with the gravity of a tombstone, loading his station wagon with enough canned peaches to sustain a small army through a decade of siege. "Mr. Twain!" he shouted, his eyes wide with the sort of religious fervor usually reserved for tent revivals. "Have you secured your perimeter? Have you purchased a hand-cranked radio? The zeros are coming, Mark! The zeros are coming!" I looked at his peaches and then at his frantic brow. "My dear sir," I said, "if the world truly ends because a calculator can't tell its grandfather's birth date from its own, I suspect a surplus of peaches will be the least of our requirements. I plan to face the apocalypse the way I face most inconveniences, with a sturdy cigar and the hope that my neighbors have better whiskey than I do." He didn't listen, of course. He was too busy worrying about embedded systems. This is a new term that implies that even your microwave has a brain, and that brain is currently contemplating a nervous breakdown. It is a peculiar triumph of the 20th century that man has managed to surround himself with millions of tiny invisible servants only to realize he has given them the power to go on strike all at once. The newspapers are no better. They treat the Y2K bug as if it were a literal insect the size of a rhinoceros, perched atop the Empire State Building and sharpening its mandibles. They publish maps showing where the blackouts will start, following the sun across the globe like a shadow of ignorance. They tell us to keep hard copies of our bank statements, as if a piece of paper will be of any use when the world has reverted to a state of nature where the only currency is a sharp stick and a handful of gravel. I find it particularly delicious that this catastrophe is born entirely of thrift. The programmers saved a few bits of memory back in the 60s and 70s because memory was expensive. It is the classic human blunder, saving a nickel today to ensure $1 million disaster tomorrow. It is like building a grand cathedral, but deciding to leave out the mortar because lime is at a premium, then acting surprised when the whole pile of rocks comes down on your head during the first heavy rain. I sat in a cafe recently and overheard two young men discussing their bunkers. One of them was a software engineer, a title that sounds like someone who builds bridges out of gossamer and wishes. "I've got 300 gallons of water and a wood-burning stove," the engineer said, looking quite proud of himself. "When the grid goes down and the COBOL systems fail, I'll be the only one on the block who can cook a hot meal." "And what will you cook?" I asked, unable to restrain myself. "Dehydrated beef stroganoff," he replied, with the solemnity of a man describing the Holy Grail. I reflected then that if the price of survival is a diet of dehydrated stroganoff, perhaps the zeros are doing us a favor. I would rather go out in a blaze of digital glory than spend the next 20 years eating salted cardboard in a hole in the ground. But there is a deeper irony here, one that tickles the ribs of a man who has seen the world change from wood to steel. In my day, we were afraid of things we could see: cholera, steamboat explosions, and the occasional disgruntled badger. In 1999, the fear is invisible. It is a ghost in the wires. It is the realization that the entire gleaming, neon-lit edifice of modern life is built upon a foundation of math that someone forgot to finish. The information age has turned out to be the anxiety age. Man has conquered the atom. He has walked on the moon, and he has invented a way to send a letter across the ocean in a heartbeat. Yet he is currently trembling in his boots because he's not sure if his VCR will know it's Saturday. It is a magnificent come-down. I've begun to think of the Y2K bug as a sort of divine prank. Perhaps the Creator, after watching us puff ourselves up with pride over our microchips and our world wide webs, decided to remind us of our place. "You think you are gods," the universe whispers. "You think you have mastered time and space? Very well. Let us see how you handle a two-digit subtraction problem." The experts, a term used for anyone who can speak for 20 minutes without breathing, claim that billions of dollars are being spent to patch the code. They are hiring retired programmers out of their nursing homes, dragging them back to the keyboards to fix the messes they made 30 years ago. It is the only time in history that being an old man who understands a dead language has become a profitable enterprise. I feel a certain kinship with these COBOL veterans. We are both remnants of a previous era, suddenly found useful, because the modern world has tripped over its own shoelaces. As I sit here writing this, the countdown clocks are everywhere. They are on the television, on the sides of buses, and probably tattooed on the foreheads of the more enthusiastic doomsday preppers. Every tick brings us closer to the moment when the 99 becomes 00. I, for one, am looking forward to it. There is something fundamentally romantic about the idea of the world resetting itself. If the lights go out, we shall simply light a candle. If the cars stop running, we shall walk. And if the computers all die, we might be forced to look at one another and hold a conversation that doesn't involve a keyboard. But I suspect, in my heart of hearts, that the zeros will come and go with a whimper rather than a bang. The sun will rise on the 1st of January, the toaster will toast, and the banker with the canned peaches will look at his cellar and realize he has to spend the next 3 years eating fruit cocktail for breakfast. The great bug is not a monster. It is a mirror. It shows us that for all our progress, we are still the same superstitious creatures who used to hide under the bed during an eclipse. We have simply traded the dragon for the glitch. I shall stay awake on the night of the 31st, not because I am afraid, but because I don't want to miss the punchline. If the world is going to end because of a math error, I want to be there to lead the applause. It is, after all, the most human way to go, defeated by our own cleverness, drowned in a sea of zeros while clutching a can of dehydrated beef. Until then, I shall continue to observe the end of days with the detached interest of a man who has already been dead once and found it rather overrated. Let the zeros come. I've always found that 00 looks remarkably like a pair of spectacles, and heaven knows this century needs a better look at itself before it starts the next one. Chapter 2. The Ghostly Ledger of the Euro. Having survived the first few weeks of the year without the world's elevators turning into vertical guillotines, I turned my attention eastward, across the Atlantic, to a continent that has spent the better part of 2 millennia perfecting the art of the bayonet. I speak, of course, of Europe, a collection of nations that historically couldn't agree on the time of day, much less the shape of a postage stamp, without someone ending up in a trench. But 1999 has brought about a miracle that makes the parting of the Red Sea look like a simple plumbing maneuver. On the 1st of January, 11 European nations decided to abandon their ancestral pride, their beautiful engraved portraits of depressed poets and conquering generals, and adopt a single, shared, and, at least for the moment, entirely imaginary currency, called the euro. Now, I have always had a complicated relationship with money. I have spent a great deal of my life acquiring it, and an even more impressive amount of time watching it vanish into the pockets of inventors whose machines didn't work and publishers whose ethics were as thin as a Sunday school soup. I understand the weight of a gold coin. I understand the satisfying crinkle of a greenback. I even understand the concept of a promise to pay, provided the man promising has a face I can reasonably trust or a house I can legally seize. But the euro, in this year of 1899 plus 100, is a phantom. It is a virtual currency. It exists only in the cold, unfeeling ledgers of bankers and the flickering ghosts of computer screens. It is money that you cannot jingle in your pocket, money you cannot use to buy a cigar, and money that you cannot drop into a beggar's hat unless the beggar is equipped with a modem and a very sophisticated understanding of exchange rates. The Europeans have decided that the best way to stop killing one another is to share a wallet. It is a noble sentiment, I suppose, but it strikes me as a dangerous experiment in domestic harmony. It is like 11 brothers who have spent their entire lives burning down each other's barns and stealing each other's cattle, suddenly deciding to open a joint checking account and hoping no one notices when the Frenchman buys a particularly expensive bottle of wine on the German's tab. I sat in a London pub, where the British, bless their stubborn island-dwelling souls, have refused to touch the euro with a 10-foot pole, and watched the news of the launch. The British cling to their pound sterling with the same grim determination that a captain clings to a sinking ship. To a Briton, the pound is not just money, it is a physical manifestation of the Queen, the cliffs of Dover, and the inherent superiority of lukewarm beer. They look at the euro and see a continental conspiracy designed to make them eat snails and take shorter naps. Across the channel, however, the mood is one of economic and monetary union, a phrase that sounds like it was invented by a man who finds the dictionary too exciting. The architects of this scheme are the bankers, a race of men who believe that the soul of humanity is best expressed in a spreadsheet. They argue that by eliminating the need to change money at every border, they will create a utopia of efficiency. In the old days, by which I mean 5 minutes ago, if you took a train from Paris to Berlin, you started with a pocketful of francs and ended with a pocketful of marks. And somewhere in the middle, the money changers at the border took a transaction fee that was essentially a polite form of highway robbery. Now, the bankers say, the invisible hand of the market will guide the euro across borders without friction. I find this fascinating. Man has spent his entire history trying to make money more tangible. We went from cattle to salt, from salt to silver, and from silver to gold. And now, at the pinnacle of our civilization, we have decided that the most advanced form of money is something that doesn't exist at all. It is a credit in a computer. It is a linguistic ledger. I asked a fellow at the bank how I might see one of these euros. "You can't, Mr. Twain," he said, smiling with the pity one reserves for a particularly slow child. "It's currently used for electronic transfers and accounting purposes only. The physical coins and notes won't be minted until 2002. "So," I replied, "you are telling me that the nations of Europe have handed over the keys to their treasuries to a ghost. They have traded their solid, dependable marks and liras for a promise that will be delivered in 3 years? My dear sir, I have sold many things in my life, mostly books and the occasional bad investment, but I have never had the audacity to sell a man a coin he couldn't see for 3 years and call it progress." The German mark was a sturdy thing. It smelled of discipline and heavy machinery. The French franc was elegant, even if it did lose its value every time a government official sneezed. The Italian lira was a work of art, mostly because you needed about 5 million of them to buy a decent suit of clothes, which gave everyone the feeling of being a millionaire until they actually tried to pay the rent. To sweep these aside for the euro, a name so bland it sounds like a brand of low-fat yogurt, is a monumental act of cultural erasure. But it is also a testament to the modern belief that globalism is the cure for all ills. The theory is that if the Germans and the French are tethered to the same currency, They won't go to war because it would be too complicated for their accountants to figure out which side is winning the exchange rate. It is peace through bookkeeping. I have my doubts. Human nature is a stubborn thing. You can give a man a new coin or a new ledger, but you haven't changed his heart. A German will still look at a Greek and wonder why he's taking a nap at 2 in the afternoon, and a Greek will still look at a German and wonder why he's so obsessed with the precision of his sausages. Putting them in the same currency is like tying two cats together by their tails and hoping they'll start acting like a dog. Furthermore, there is the matter of the central bank. This is a group of men in Frankfurt who will now decide the interest rates for the entire continent. It is a terrifying thought. In my day, if you didn't like the way the bank was run, you could at least go and throw a brick through the window. But how do you throw a brick through a central bank that governs 11 different countries? Who do you complain to when your mortgage in Portugal goes up because the economy in Finland is running a bit too hot? It is the ultimate triumph of the expert over the citizen. The euro is a currency for people who fly in airplanes and talk about synergy and macroeconomics. For the man selling onions in a market in Provence, the euro is a confusing bit of mathematics that makes his onions look cheaper on paper, but somehow harder to afford in reality. I suspect that 1999 will be remembered as the year Europe decided to perform a lobotomy on its own history in exchange for a smoother checkout process at the grocery store. They are betting that the logic of the market will override the passion of the tribe. It is a bet that I, as a man who once invested in a perpetual motion machine that refused to move even a single inch, find remarkably familiar. There is a certain vanity in thinking we can outsmart the centuries. We think that by digitizing our wealth, we have made it safer. We think that by unifying our coins, we have unified our souls. But money is just a story we all agree to tell each other. For 1,000 years, the story was told in different languages and with different accents. Now, Europe is trying to tell the story in a single, monotonous drone. I wish them luck. Truly I do. If they can make the euro work, they will have achieved something that Caesar and Napoleon couldn't manage with all the legions and cannons in the world. They will have conquered Europe with a decimal point. But as for me, I shall keep a few old francs tucked away in my drawer. They might not be efficient, and they might not be virtual. But at least I know that if the computer in Frankfurt catches a cold, or if the 00 of the Millennium Bug decides to eat the digital ledgers, I can still use a silver coin to buy a drink. In a world of ghosts, there is much to be said for something that clinks when you drop it. The euro is the birth of a new era, a quiet, bloodless birth in the sterile halls of a bank. It is the sound of 1 billion paper cuts, the rustle of 1 trillion invisible bills. It is the grand finale of a millennium that started with swords and is ending with accountability. I shall watch with interest, and if the whole thing collapses into a heap of confused debits and credits, I shall simply remind the world that I warned them. Never trust a currency that you can't use to pay a riverboat pilot. For when the water gets high and the fog rolls in, a virtual coin won't keep you off the rocks. Chapter 3. The Matrix and the Red Pill. I have always believed that man is a creature who would much rather be comfortably fooled than uncomfortably enlightened. It is the very foundation of the theater, the pulpit, and the promising prospect of a new mining stock. But this year, the brothers Wachowski have released a moving picture called The Matrix, and it has plunged me into an existential crisis so profound that I spent 3 hours yesterday staring at a teaspoon, waiting for it to melt. Going to a cinema in 1999 is an ordeal in itself. One must navigate floors so sticky they could serve as a permanent trap for unwary rodents, and purchase a bucket of corn so heavily salted it could preserve a pharaoh for the next 3 millennia. But once the lights dim and the green rain of code begins to fall across the screen, one forgets the salt and the stickiness. One begins to suspect that the very seat beneath one's trousers is a digital mirage. The premise of this film is as follows. It is not actually 1999. It is, in fact, several centuries later. The world has been scorched to a cinder, and humanity has been enslaved by a race of sentient machines who use us as glorified AA batteries. To keep our minds from wandering or, heaven forbid, complaining about the lack of sunlight, the machines have plugged our brains into a giant collective dream called the Matrix. It is 1899 plus 100, but it is all a lie. The steak you're eating is just a signal to your brain. The rain on your face is merely a line of math, and the man sitting next to you is nothing more than a very sophisticated bit of punctuation in a cosmic sentence. Now, I have spent a lifetime dealing with fiction. I have made a very comfortable living by lying to people for their own amusement. But the idea that the entire world is a work of fiction written by a bored computer is a stroke of genius that would make even the most audacious riverboat gambler blush. The hero of this tale is a young man named Neo, a hacker, who spends his nights hunched over a computer screen looking for the truth. He reminds me of the young men I used to see in the gold fields of California, eyes wild with the hope of striking the motherlode, though in Neo's case, the motherlode is the realization that his life is a sham. He is rescued by a man named Morpheus, a fellow with a voice like a landslide and a pair of sunglasses that appear to be held onto his face by sheer force of will. Morpheus offers Neo a choice that has since become the talk of every dinner table in the country: the blue pill or the red pill. The blue pill. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You continue to eat your imaginary steak and pay your imaginary taxes. The red pill. You stay in Wonderland, and Morpheus shows you how deep the rabbit hole goes. I sat there in the dark, clutching my salted corn, and I asked myself, Mark, which pill would you take? On the one hand, the truth is a noble thing. On the other hand, the truth in this movie involves waking up in a vat of pink slime, bald and covered in copper wires, only to discover that the only thing for breakfast is a bowl of gray wheat-like mush. As a man who has always appreciated a clean collar and a well-marbled ribeye, I found the real world to be remarkably lacking in charm. If the choice is between a beautiful lie and a hideous truth, humanity will choose the lie every time and will ask for a side of gravy to go with it. But the film doesn't stop at the choice. It goes on to suggest that once you realize the world is a simulation, you can start to break its rules. Neo begins to dodge bullets with the grace of a gazelle. He learns kung fu in 5 seconds by having it downloaded into his skull. And he eventually realizes that gravity is merely a suggestion made by a bureaucrat. I must say, I find the idea of downloading expertise to be the most enviable part of the whole affair. I spent years learning to pilot a steamboat on the Mississippi, memorizing every snag, sandbar, and dead tree from St. Louis to New Orleans. If I could have simply had a man plug a wire into the back of my neck and download the river, I could have spent those years much more productively, probably by sleeping or inventing a new way to avoid my creditors. However, the architect of this matrix, the machine mind behind the curtain, is a figure that haunts me. He is the ultimate editor. He has looked at the messy, chaotic history of man and decided that it would be much more efficient if it were all reduced to a series of zeros and ones. I find myself looking at the people on the street now and wondering if they are programs. That fella over there, the one who always forgets to tip his hat, is he a human soul, or is he just a bit of Agent Smith code designed to keep the sidewalk looking populated? And what of myself? I am a man of the 19th century, currently haunting the end of the 20th. Am I a glitch? Am I a legacy file that the system forgot to delete when it upgraded to the 1999 version? The existential dread is compounded by the agents, men in suits who represent the system's desire for order. They are the ultimate school marms, the ultimate tax collectors, the ultimate no, in a world that wants to say yes. They can move through walls and take over anyone's body. It is a perfect metaphor for the modern world. The individual is nothing, and the system is everything. I left the theater and stepped out into the night air of 1999. The neon signs were humming, the taxis were honking, and the air smelled of exhaust and ambition. I looked at a brick wall and had a sudden, terrifying urge to run at it and see if I would pass through or merely end up with a very real concussion. I decided against it. Even if the wall is made of code, the pain signal it sends to my brain is remarkably convincing. We are living in an age where the line between what is real and what is rendered is becoming thinner than the excuses of a politician. We have virtual reality, we have CGI in our movies, and we have people spending their entire lives in chat rooms, talking to people they have never met about lives they aren't actually living. The Matrix has merely taken our current trajectory and followed it to its logical, terrifying conclusion. If we continue to prefer the screen to the street, we shall eventually find ourselves in the vat of slime, dreaming of a 1999 that never was. I find a certain irony in the fact that the machines chose the end of the 20th century as the peak of human civilization. They didn't choose the Renaissance, or the height of the Roman Empire, or even the glory days of the Mississippi River. They chose the era of the cubicle, the cellular phone, and the Y2K panic. It suggests that even the machines have a very low opinion of our potential. But perhaps there is hope. In the film, the one thing the machines cannot account for is human choice, the irrational, stubborn, beautiful tendency of a man to do exactly what he shouldn't do, simply because he feels like it. I shall take that as my comfort. Even if I am a simulation, I shall be a simulation with a mind of its own. I shall continue to wear my white suit. I shall continue to smoke my cigars. And if I ever meet the architect of this digital dream, I shall have a few pointed questions for him regarding the quality of the 1999 dialogue and the unnecessary complexity of the tax code. In the meantime, I have decided to treat the world as if it were real, Not because I am convinced it is, but because the imaginary coffee still tastes good, and the imaginary sun still feels warm on my back. And if one day the green code starts falling from the sky, and I realize I am just a ghost in a machine, I shall simply tip my hat to the programmer and ask if he has any updates that might improve my knees. The red pill is a heavy burden, but I suppose it is better to be a conscious battery than a sleeping one, though, if I'm honest, I'd still trade a bit of the truth for a really good non-virtual piece of huckleberry pie. For that is the true test of reality. You can simulate a bullet, you can simulate a skyscraper, and you can simulate a kung fu kick. But I have yet to see a computer that can truly capture the sublime, sticky, glorious truth of a summer afternoon on a riverbank. Until then, the machines can keep their matrix. I'll stay here in the glitch, making as much noise as I possibly can. Chapter 4. The Blackberry in the Pocket. As I navigate the strange, crowded waters of 1999, I have noticed a peculiar change in the anatomy of the American citizen. In my day, a man's hands were used for honest labor, steering a wheel, gripping a plow, or, in my case, holding a pen until the ink stained my soul. If a man's thumbs were active, he was either hitchhiking, shucking corn, or perhaps losing a game of mercy behind the woodshed. But today, the thumb has undergone a radical promotion. It has become the most important appendage in the human arsenal, all thanks to a small, dark, plastic wafer known as the BlackBerry 850. I find the name itself to be a masterful piece of deception. A blackberry is a delightful fruit, synonymous with summer afternoons, stained lips, and grandmother's preserves. It is something you find in a bramble, not in a boardroom. To name a piece of electronic hardware after a berry is a stroke of marketing genius. It suggests that being tethered to your employer's every whim is as natural and sweet as a stroll through a meadow. If they had been honest, they would have called it the electronic leash or the pocket-sized taskmaster. But I suppose those names didn't test well with the focus groups. The device itself is a curious little object, roughly the size of a bar of soap, featuring a tiny screen and a keyboard so miniature that it appears to have been designed for a highly literate breed of hamster. It is the evolution of the pager, a device that used to simply beep at a man to tell him he was needed elsewhere, much like a dinner bell for a dog. But the BlackBerry 850 has graduated. It doesn't just tell you that someone is looking for you, it allows them to deliver their grievances, their demands, and their status reports directly into your palm, regardless of whether you are in the bathtub or at a funeral. I have spent a good deal of time observing the BlackBerry users in their natural habitat, which usually seems to be the corridors of airports or the sidewalks of New York. They are a fascinating, tragic species. You can spot them from a distance by the BlackBerry prayer, a posture in which the head is bowed, the shoulders are hunched, and the elbows are tucked in while the thumbs dance a frantic, twitching jig upon the tiny buttons. They remind me of nothing so much as a flock of nervous pigeons. If you have ever watched a pigeon on a cobblestone street, you know the rhythm. A quick, sharp peck, peck, peck at a crumb, followed by a frantic glance around to see if anyone is coming to steal it, followed by more peck, peck, pecking. The modern businessman has adopted this exact behavior. He pecks at his digital crust, an email, they call it, with a desperation that suggests that if he stops for even a second, the entire global economy will collapse, or worse, his boss will think he is actually enjoying his lunch. The email is, of course, the great curse of this era. In my time, if a man wanted to bother me with a trivial question, he had to sit down, find a piece of paper, dip a pen in an inkwell, and then wait 3 days for the post to deliver his nonsense. By the time the letter arrived, he had usually forgotten what he was angry about, or better yet, he had died. It was a marvelous system that favored the patient and protected the busy. But now, a thought can travel from a brain in London to a pocket in San Francisco in the time it takes to sneeze. This is hailed as a triumph of connectivity, but I see it for what it truly is, the death of the out-of-office excuse. In 1899, if I were on a riverboat in the middle of the Mississippi, I was, for all intents and purposes, on another planet. No one could reach me. I was a free man. In 1999, a man can be on the moon, and his BlackBerry will still buzz with a message from a subordinate asking where he keeps the extra staples. I decided to try my hand at one of these devices, as I have always been a sucker for a new gadget. I once invested in a typesetting machine that had more moving parts than a Swiss watch and a temperament more volatile than a jilted opera singer, so I am no stranger to the follies of progress. I held the BlackBerry 850 in my hand and attempted to compose a simple greeting. I immediately discovered that my thumbs are entirely too large for the task. They are 19th century thumbs, broad, sturdy, and accustomed to the tactile feedback of a physical world. Trying to hit the A key without simultaneously engaging the S, the Q, and the Shift button is a task that requires the precision of a diamond cutter and the patience of a saint. After 10 minutes of intense labor, I had managed to produce the following sentence: Hecco arg wetger us fube. I am told that with practice, one becomes fluent in this thumb language. There is even a new dialect emerging, a shorthand for the impatient. They use U for U, R for R, and L8R for later. It is a linguistic tragedy. We have spent centuries refining the English language into a sharp, elegant tool, only to have it blunted into a series of grunts and numbers because we are in too much of a hurry to type the letter Y. We are reverting to the status of cavemen, only instead of painting bisons on walls, we are tapping LOL into a piece of plastic. The psychological toll of the BlackBerry is perhaps its most insidious feature. It has created a new kind of presence. A man is no longer where his body is, he is where his BlackBerry is. I saw a couple at a restaurant last night. A handsome pair, well-dressed and clearly out for a romantic evening. But instead of looking into each other's eyes and discussing the mysteries of the soul, they spent the entire meal looking down at their laps, their thumbs blurred in a frantic race to see who could respond to their notifications first. They were together, yet they were 1,000 miles apart. They were connected to everyone in the world except the person sitting 3 feet away from them. I found myself wanting to lean over and ask if the BlackBerry was at least paying for half of the wine. And then there is the buzz. The BlackBerry has a vibrate mode, a feature designed to alert the user discreetly. However, it is about as discreet as a rattlesnake in a silent movie. I have seen men in the middle of a serious lecture suddenly twitch as if they had been struck by a bolt of lightning, their hands diving for their pockets with a look of pure addiction. They call it crackberry in some circles, and the moniker is well earned. The device provides a tiny, constant drip of dopamine, a new message, a new alert, a new reminder that you are important. Man has always craved importance, but he used to earn it by winning battles, writing symphonies, or discovering new continents. Now, he feels important because a machine in his pocket told him he has 17 unread memos regarding the quarterly budget for paperclips. I fear for the future. If the BlackBerry 850 is the beginning, where does it end? Will we eventually have devices implanted in our retinas so we never have to look at a tree again? Will our thumbs evolve into long, needle-like probes specifically designed for tapping on glass? The 1999 humans believe they are masters of their technology. They think the BlackBerry is a tool that serves them, but from where I sit, it looks like the roles have been reversed. The machines are the masters, and we are the pigeons, pecking away at our tiny keyboards, terrified that we might miss a single, meaningless crumb of information. I shall keep my BlackBerry in my pocket, but I think I shall leave the battery at home. I prefer the old way of being unreachable. There is a certain dignity in being a man who cannot be summed up in a series of pings. And if the world truly needs to find me, they can do what they've always done. Wait for me to show up at the bar or send a letter and hope I'm in the mood to read it. After all, a man who is always available is a man who has nothing better to do. And I, for one, have a great deal of nothing to get back to, and I don't need a status update to tell me how I'm doing it. Chapter 5. The Shadow of Columbine. I have often said that man is the only animal that blushes, or needs to. In the April of 1999, I found myself wishing that the human race would take a permanent shade of crimson and perhaps retire from the business of civilization altogether for a few decades to think about what it has done. We had been so busy, you see. We were busy worrying about whether our toasters would revolt at midnight. We were busy marveling at digital coins and thumb-sized keyboards. We were busy arguing over whether we lived in a computer simulation. And then, in a quiet suburb of Colorado called Littleton, the information age was slapped across the face by a reality so ancient and so ugly that all the microchips in Silicon Valley couldn't calculate a way to make it make sense. I have seen my share of violence. I saw the country torn asunder in the 1860s, a time when we killed each other over grand, terrible ideas with muskets and bayonets. But there is a particular modern flavor of horror that belongs to 1999. It is the horror of the school shooting, a phrase that sounds as natural in the mouth of a news anchor as forecast for rain, and yet represents a total collapse of the human machinery. When the news broke, the information age did what it does best. It turned a tragedy into a circus and invited the entire world to watch the tigers eat the performers in high definition. I sat before the television and watched the rolling news cycle, a magnificent invention designed to ensure that no one ever has a moment of silent reflection. They have experts for everything now. They have experts on ballistics, experts on adolescent psychology, and experts on what kind of breakfast cereal leads to a life of crime. The first thing the experts did was look for a scapegoat. Man is never happier than when he can blame a catastrophe on a piece of furniture or a catchy tune. "It was the video games," shouted one faction of pundits. They pointed to a game called Doom, where one runs through corridors shooting demons. I find this logic to be of the highest caliber of stupidity. I spent my youth reading about pirates and highwaymen. I witnessed more simulated violence in the pages of cheap novels than a modern child sees on a screen. Yet I never felt the urge to go out and shoot a haberdasher. If playing a game makes you a killer, then surely playing a game of Monopoly should make every child a billionaire by the age of 12. The world is currently short about 6 billion billionaires, so I suspect the theory has its leaks. "It was the music," shouted another group. They pointed to a fellow named Marilyn Manson, a gentleman who appears to have applied his makeup with a trowel and whose primary talent seems to be making parents feel a sudden, urgent need to check the locks on the front door. They blamed his lyrics, his stage presence, and his choice of contact lenses. It is a classic human maneuver. If you don't like the mirror, you blame the person who manufactured the glass. Then came the trench coat mafia. The news discovered that the perpetrators wore long black coats, and suddenly every duster in America was treated as if it were a concealed weapon. I have worn a long coat myself for many years, primarily because it covers a multitude of sins and provides a dignified silhouette. To suggest that a garment can corrupt the soul is like suggesting that wearing a top hat makes one a mathematician. But beneath the frantic searching for a cause, the games, the music, the movies, the internet, there was a deeper, more chilling realization that the pundits didn't want to touch with a 10-foot pole. I call it the loneliness of the wired child. We have built a world in 1999 where a boy can sit in his bedroom and communicate with a stranger in Peking via a chat room. He can access the sum total of human knowledge with a few clicks of a mouse. He is connected to the global nervous system, and yet he can go through an entire day at school and never be seen by a single living soul. He can be surrounded by hundreds of his peers and feel as if he is a ghost haunting his own life. We have wired the planet, but we have managed to insulate the individual. We have made it possible to be together while being entirely alone. In my day, if a boy was troubled, he usually ended up talking to a grandmother, a village blacksmith, or a particularly patient dog. There was a community, a word that implies people who actually know your name and notice when your eyes are downcast. In 1999, we have users and profiles, but we are losing the neighbor. The tragedy in Colorado was not a failure of technology. It was a failure of the human heart to keep pace with its own inventions. We have given our children the tools of gods and the social support of a desert island. I watch the politicians on the television, those marvelous creatures who can speak for an hour and never accidentally say anything. They offered thoughts and prayers, which is the political equivalent of tipping a waiter with a polite smile instead of money. They debated gun control, a topic that generates more heat than a steamboat boiler and roughly as much forward motion as a mule with a grudge. One side argued that the problem was the tool, while the other argued the problem was the person. As usual, they are both half right and entirely useless. A man with a gun can do more damage than a man with a stick. That is a matter of simple physics. But a man who wants to do damage is a problem that no law can fully solve until we address why he feels the world is his enemy in the first place. I walked through a park a few days after the event. I saw children playing, their laughter echoing against the spring air, and I felt a profound sense of grief, not just for the lost, but for the living. The world they are inheriting is one where security means metal detectors at the schoolhouse door, and safety means teaching a 6-year-old how to hide under a desk. Is this what we have wrought with our century of progress? We have split the atom and mapped the genome, but we are terrified of our own offspring. There is a grim irony in the fact that the information age has made us more ignorant of our own neighbors. We know everything about the celebrity in Hollywood, what she ate for breakfast, who she is dating, what kind of shoes she prefers. But we don't know the name of the lad who sits in the next desk in the algebra class. We are drowning in data and starving for a single moment of genuine connection. I suspect that when the history of 1999 is written, the Y2K Bug will be remembered as an amusing footnote, a time when we were afraid of a clock. But the shadow of Columbine will remain. It is the reminder that the most dangerous glitch is not in the computer, but in the social fabric. We think we are so clever with our World Wide Webs and our Blackberries. But a web is also something that entangles, and a berry can be poisonous. We have built a magnificent, glowing, high-speed highway to nowhere, and we are surprised when some of our travelers decide to drive off the cliff. I return to my desk, my wit feeling heavy and blunt. There are some things that cannot be satirized, and some tragedies that defy the comforting balm of a joke. All I could do was hope that as the zeros and ones of the new millennium approached, we might find a way to use our incredible connectivity to actually connect. To look a child in the eye and say, "I see you." To listen not to the data, but to the silence. To realize that the most important interface is not a screen, but a human face. But as I looked at the television, where the pundits were already moving on to the next scandal and the next outrage, I feared that we are a race that learns nothing and forgets everything. We shall build higher fences, buy better metal detectors, and hire more experts, all while the wired child sits in the dark, waiting for someone to notice that he is still there. The shadow is long, and the sun is setting on the 19th century. I can only pray that in the 21st we might find a way to be as smart about our hearts as we are about our machines. Though, if history is any guide, I wouldn't bet a wooden nickel on it. Chapter 6. The Jar Jar. Jarring. If there is one thing I have learned in my long and varied career as a writer, a lecturer, and a professional observer of human folly, it is that a man will cheerfully pay $1 to see a ghost, but he will burn down the theater if you promise him a god and deliver a puppet. In the summer of 1999, the American public, and indeed much of the civilized world, underwent a collective religious experience of such magnitude that it made the Great Awakening look like a quiet afternoon nap. I refer, of course, to the arrival of Star Wars, Episode I, The Phantom Menace. Now, I was not around for the original trilogy of these Star Wars moving pictures, being busy at the time with the afterlife and various clerical matters involving my own legacy. But even a ghost can see that, for the people of 1999, George Lucas is not merely a filmmaker. He is a high priest, a grand architect, and a man who has managed to convince the world that a vacuum cleaner, noises-making robot is the pinnacle of dramatic acting. The anticipation for this film was not a hype. It was an industrial complex. For months, I watched as otherwise sane adults stood in lines outside of theaters, living in tents on the sidewalk like refugees from a war that hadn't happened yet. They were waiting for a glimpse of the Force, a mystical energy that apparently allows one to move objects with one's mind and, more importantly, sell billions of dollars in plastic figurines. I saw men in business suits carrying lightsabers, which are essentially glowing neon broomsticks, and discussing the midichlorian count with the solemnity of a doctor delivering a terminal diagnosis. I must admit, I find the concept of a prequel to be a magnificent bit of narrative gymnastics. It is the art of telling a story that everyone already knows the ending to, and charging them twice as much to see how it started. It is like writing a biography of a man by starting with his great-grandfather's plumbing problems. But the fans didn't care. They wanted to go back to the galaxy far, far away, a place they seemed to prefer over their own living rooms. When the lights finally went down in the theater, the excitement was so thick you could have carved it into bricks and built a cathedral. The famous yellow words began to crawl across the screen, and the audience roared as if they were witnessing the actual creation of the universe. I leaned forward, ready to be transported, and then we were introduced to the taxation of trade routes. I have sat through many things in my life. I have sat through 3-hour sermons in humid Missouri churches. I have sat through congressional debates on the coinage of silver. I have even sat through a performance of Hamlet by a troupe of traveling actors who couldn't remember their lines or their names. But I never expected to see a space epic, a story of knights and magic, open with a thrilling discussion of intergalactic bureaucratic tariffs. The plot, as far as I could gather, involved a group of people in very elaborate hats, sitting in a circular room and talking about trade disputes. I looked around the theater. The fans, who had been waiting for 16 years for this moment, looked as if they had been promised a riot and given a lecture on accounting. It is a bold choice for a filmmaker to assume that children, who are the primary audience for these things, have a deep and abiding interest in the legislative maneuvers of a celestial senate. But the taxation of trade routes was merely the appetizer. The main course arrived shortly thereafter in the form of a creature called Jar Jar Binks. Jar Jar is what they call CGI, computer-generated imagery. He is a creature made entirely of light and math, a digital puppet that does not exist in the physical world. He is a tall, orange, amphibious fellow with ears like pancakes and a grasp of the English language that suggests he was hit in the head with a very large mallet shortly before his first scene. In my day, a jester was a man whose job was to be funny. Jar Jar Binks's job is to be jarring. He trips over his own feet, he gets his tongue stuck in things, and he speaks in a dialect that sounds like a man trying to talk through a mouthful of marbles while underwater. I have never seen a character so meticulously designed to be lovable and yet so universally loathed. He is the digital equivalent of a persistent mosquito that has somehow learned to tell bad jokes. I watched the screen as Jar Jar flopped and flailed, and I felt a profound sense of pity for the actors, the real breathing humans like Liam Neeson, who had to stand in front of a green wall and pretend they were talking to this digital nightmare. It is the ultimate triumph of the information age. We have replaced the soul of the actor with the whim of the programmer. And here we find the industrialization of hype. George Lucas having discovered that he could create anything with his computers, seems to have forgotten to ask if he should. The screen was cluttered with spectacle: cities under the sea, vast armies of robots, races through desert canyons. It was a feast for the eyes, but it was a famine for the heart. The film was not a story, it was a catalog. Every frame was designed to be turned into a toy, a video game, or a commemorative soda cup. I walked into a grocery store the week after the premiere and saw Jar Jar Binks' face on a box of breakfast cereal, a bag of potato chips, and, most inexplicably, a bottle of industrial-strength floor cleaner. We have reached a point where the movie is merely the 2-hour advertisement for the merchandise. The fans were so busy waiting for the future of cinema that they didn't notice the cinema had been replaced by a shopping mall. They had spent months building up an image of George Lucas as a visionary genius, and he responded by giving them a 2-hour commercial for a new line of action figures and a very confusing lesson in galactic trade policy. I felt a certain heartbreak for the nerds, a wonderful, passionate group of people who are the only ones left in 1999 who truly believe in the power of myth. They wanted to believe. They tried to believe. I saw men leaving the theater with hollow looks in their eyes, trying to convince themselves that the pod race made up for the fact that the hero of the story was a 9-year-old boy who seemed more interested in his droids than in the fate of the galaxy. "It'll be better in the second one," I heard a fellow say to his friend. "He's just setting up the pieces. You wait until 2002. It is the eternal optimism of the swindled. They have been sold a bill of goods, and they are already looking forward to the next installment of the swindle. I, for one, found the Phantom Menace to be a very accurate title. The menace is the realization that the more technology we have, the less magic we seem to produce. We have the ability to create entire worlds out of zeros and ones, but we haven't yet figured out how to program a soul. We can make a character who can jump 100 feet into the air and dodge laser beams, but we can't make one that makes us care if he lives or dies." I returned to my hotel, my ears still ringing with the sound of explosions and the grating Mesa called Jar Jar accent. I reflected that if this is the future of storytelling, I am quite content to remain a relic of the past. Give me a man on a stage with a good story and a few simple props any day. Give me a riverboat pilot who can describe a sunset without the help of 1,000 digital artists. The industrialization of hype has turned the theater into a factory. We are no longer audiences. We are consumers. We are being fed a diet of plastic and light, and we are being told it is a banquet. I shall stay away from the next episode. I have seen enough trade disputes and digital amphibians to last me for several lifetimes. But I suspect the lines are already starting to form for the year 2002. Man is a creature of habit, and his favorite habit is paying to be disappointed by the things he loves. As for me, I think I'll go find a quiet corner and read a book. A book doesn't require a midichlorian count. It doesn't try to sell me a commemorative soda cup, and most importantly, it doesn't have a Jar Jar Binks. Chapter 7. The Napster Rebellion. I have always had a sneaking unchristian admiration for a well-executed swindle, provided it is done with flair and directed at someone who richly deserves it. In my day, the grandest thieves were the railroad kings and the land speculators, Men who would steal the shoes off a sleeping orphan and then charge him rent for the sidewalk. But 1999 has produced a new kind of pirate, one who doesn't need a cutlass, a black flag, or even a sturdy pair of sea legs. All he needs is a dormitory room, a diet of cold pizza, and a piece of software called Napster. The perpetrator of this particular upheaval is a lad named Sean Fanning. He is 19 years old, which is precisely the age when a man has the most energy and the least respect for the concept of intellectual property. He has created a system called peer-to-peer file sharing, a phrase that sounds like a polite Sunday school activity, but is actually a declaration of war against every record executive in the civilized world. To understand the magnitude of this rebellion, one must first understand the music barons. For decades, these gentlemen have presided over a magnificent racket. They take a singer, wrap his tinned sound in a plastic disc called a compact disc, CD, and sell it to the public for $18. The singer gets a nickel, the public gets one song they actually like, and 11 tracks of filler that sound like a cat being introduced to a vacuum cleaner, and the barons pocket the rest to pay for their mahogany desks and their third divorces. It was a perfect system, as solid and impenetrable as the Great Wall of China. And then came the MP3. An MP3 is a piece of music that has been compressed into a digital file. It has no physical form, it cannot be held, it cannot be polished, and it cannot be dropped on the floor to see if it shatters. It is, for all intents and purposes, the ghost of a song. And Sean Fanning realized that if you have a ghost, you can invite it to dinner at 1,000,000 houses at the same time without the ghost ever getting tired. Napster is the table where everyone meets to swap ghosts. I spent an afternoon watching a young fellow use this program. He typed the name of a song into a little box, and within minutes, the song was traveling from a computer in Sweden or Cincinnati directly into his own. He didn't pay a cent. He didn't leave his chair. He didn't even have to look a music baron in the eye. "Is this legal?" I asked, fascinated by the sheer efficiency of the theft. "It's not stealing, Mr. Twain," the lad replied with the earnestness of a man who has just discovered a new religion. "It's sharing. I'm just letting my friends borrow my music. It just so happens that I have 15 million friends I've never met. I have spent a good portion of my life arguing for the sanctity of copyright. I have traveled to London and Washington to lobby for the rights of authors, arguing that a man's ideas are as much his property as his house or his horse. If someone were to take Huckleberry Finn, print 10,000 copies of it, and give them away for free at the docks, I would have been the first man to reach for a dueling pistol. But there is something about the music barons that makes me want to join the pirates. Perhaps it is because they have treated the public with such magnificent contempt for so long. They have made a fortune selling air, and now they are shocked, positively scandalized, to find that the air has escaped the bottle and is blowing wherever it pleases. The reaction from the industry has been a spectacle of the highest order. They have reacted with the grace of a hippopotamus trying to catch a hummingbird. They are filing lawsuits. They are calling for the FBI. They are appearing on television to weep about the death of art. My favorite part of the drama involves a musical troupe called Metallica. These are gentlemen who specialize in a brand of noise that sounds like a boiler explosion set to a rhythm. Their drummer, a fellow named Lars Ulrich, has become the face of the anti-Napster crusade. He is a multimillionaire who is deeply, personally offended that a college student in Idaho is listening to Enter Sandman for free. I watched him testify before the Senate, and I couldn't help but chuckle. There is nothing quite so funny as a rebel who has become a landlord. He made his fame and fortune by being loud, aggressive, and anti-establishment. But the moment the establishment included his own bank account, he became as litigious as a Victorian widow contesting a will. He handed over a list of 300,000 fans who had shared his music, effectively telling his most loyal supporters that he would like them all to be put in digital stocks and pelted with virtual tomatoes. It is a bold marketing strategy. Buy my records or I'll sue you into the Stone Age. I suspect it will work about as well as trying to stop the tide with a bucket. The truth is, the world changed while the music barons were at lunch. They think they are fighting a service, but they are actually fighting a habit. Once a human being discovers that he can have exactly what he wants, when he wants it, for the price of nothing, you cannot convince him to go back to the $18 plastic disc. You might as well try to convince a man who has discovered the electric light to go back to reading by the glow of a damp match. Napster is the riverboat gambler of the 1990s. It has seen the industry's hand realize they were bluffing with a pair of twos and decided to take the entire pot. The barons are screaming that the sky is falling, but what they really mean is that the monopoly is falling. I find a profound irony in the fact that the very technology they use to make their music digital and perfect is the very technology that is now being used to dismantle their empires. They wanted the clarity of the laser, but they forgot that light travels through glass in both directions. What we are witnessing is the democratization of the note. Music is returning to its original state, as something that exists in the air, shared between people, rather than something locked in a vault and guarded by men in expensive suits. Of course, the artists deserve to be paid. Even a pirate needs to eat. But the system that required $1 billion infrastructure to move a 3-minute melody from a singer's throat to a listener's ear is obsolete. It is a stagecoach in the age of the locomotive. I sat back and watched the downloads progress on the screen. A song by a fellow named Prince, who has currently changed his name to a symbol that looks like a deranged weather vane, was flickering into existence. Then a bit of Mozart. Then a bit of something called Britney Spears, which I can only describe as the musical equivalent of a pink marshmallow, sweet, airy, and entirely devoid of nutritional value. The library of the world is now open to anyone with a phone line and a bit of patience. It is a glorious, chaotic mess. It is the end of the album and the beginning of the track. It is the end of the expert who tells you what is good and the beginning of the user who decides for himself. I suspect Napster will eventually be crushed. The lawyers are too many and the laws are too old. They will shut down the servers, they will find the lad Fanning, and they will declare victory. But it will be a hollow triumph. The secret is out. The ghost has tasted freedom, and he's not going back into the plastic disc for anyone. The 1999 rebellion is not about money, really. It's about the realization that in the digital world, property is an illusion. If I have an idea and I give it to you, I still have the idea. We both have it. In the physical world, if I give you my horse, I am walking. In the digital world, we are both riding. The music barons want us to keep walking so they can sell us more horses. But the Napster lad has shown us how to breed horses out of thin air. I shall keep my old records, of course. I like the scratch and the hiss. It reminds me of the friction of life. But I cannot help but tip my hat to the pirates. They have turned the world upside down with a few lines of code, and they have done it with a wit and a daring that would make Jean Lafitte proud. The digital high seas are open, and the wind is blowing hard. I suggest the music barons start learning how to swim, because their galleons are taking on water fast, and the Enter Sandman is playing on every deck for free. Chapter 8. The Sponge Under the Sea. I have spent a lifetime studying the various ways a human being can be amused, and I have found that the threshold for what constitutes a joke is as shifty as a Mississippi sandbar after a spring flood. In my day, we were satisfied with a well-timed pun, a bit of political satire, or perhaps the spectacle of a man trying to chase his own hat through a mud puddle. We appreciated the tall tale, the story of a frog that could outjump a horse, or a man who could outtalk a thunderstorm. But as I sit here in the twilight of 1999, I must confess that the youth of this nation have moved into a realm of absurdity so profound that I find myself checking my own pulse just to see if I'm still connected to the same reality. I am speaking, of course, of a creature named SpongeBob SquarePants. He debuted this May, appearing on a glowing box called Nickelodeon, a name that suggests a theater where one might see a silent moving picture for a 5-cent piece. But what I witnessed was not a silent picture. It was a riot of primary colors and high-pitched squealing centered around a protagonist who is, and I say this with the utmost gravity, a common yellow kitchen sponge. Now, I have seen many strange things in my time. I have seen the Cardiff Giant, a supposed prehistoric man that turned out to be a bit of carved gypsum and a lot of public gullibility. I have seen perpetual motion machines that required a hidden man to turn a crank. But I have never seen a kitchen utensil wear a necktie, inhabit a pineapple at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, and command the rapt attention of 10 million children. The anatomy of the absurd. To look upon SpongeBob is to witness the final surrender of human logic. He is bright yellow, porous, and remarkably square. He wears a pair of brown trousers, a white shirt, and a red tie, the uniform of a junior accountant who has somehow wandered into a tragic bleaching accident. The residence. He lives in a pineapple. Why a pineapple? Why not a discarded boot or a tin of sardines, which would at least be consistent with the geography of the ocean floor? There is no explanation. One is simply expected to accept the pineapple as a fact of nature, like gravity or the dishonesty of a land speculator. The occupation. He works as a fry cook at an establishment called the Krusty Krab. Here, he flips Krabby Patties with a religious fervor that I haven't seen since the last time a gold vein was discovered in the Sierras, the temperament. He is possessed of an optimism so relentless, so aggressive, that it borders on the psychopathic. He laughs at everything. He finds joy in the act of breathing. He is the physical manifestation of a man who has had his common sense surgically removed and replaced with a bubble-blowing kit. I watched an episode where this sponge and his friend, a pink starfish named Patrick, whose intellectual capacity is roughly that of a lukewarm turnip, decided to start a campfire underwater. I sat there, my cigar going cold in my hand, watching these two creatures huddle around a crackling blaze while surrounded by trillions of gallons of seawater. In my day, if an author suggested a fire could burn at the bottom of the ocean, he would be laughed out of the publisher's office and perhaps institutionalized for his own safety. But in 1999, the children simply nod and ask for more. It is a magnificent triumph of the imagination over the laws of physics. It suggests that the new generation doesn't just ignore the rules, they've forgotten that the rules ever existed. The supporting cast of misanthropes. But for all the yellow joy on display, there is one character who speaks to my soul. I refer to Squidward Tentacles. Squidward is a blue, six-legged creature who plays the clarinet with the skill of a man strangling a goose and works as a cashier with the enthusiasm of a prisoner on a chain gang. He is a misanthrope, a cynic, and a failed artist. He is, in short, the only person in the entire show who has a lick of sense. He lives between the exuberant sponge and the moronic starfish, and he spends his days in a state of perpetual, simmering fury. I watched him try to enjoy a quiet afternoon of painting, only to have his peace shattered by the sponge's high-pitched, "I'm ready" chant. I know that feeling, Squidward. I have spent many a day trying to write a serious reflection on the nature of man, only to be interrupted by a neighbor who wanted to show me his new patent for a self-oiling shoehorn. Squidward is the 19th century man trapped in a 21st century nightmare. He wants order, he wants dignity, and he wants his neighbors to go away. And he is perpetually denied all three. Then there is Mr. Krabs, the owner of the Krusty Krab. He is a crustacean of such profound greed that he makes the robber barons of my era look like philanthropic monks. He loves money with a passion that is almost romantic. He keeps his first dollar in a frame. He would sell his own soul for a nickel and complain that he didn't get a better exchange rate. I've found Mr. Krabs to be the most realistic part of the whole affair, a man, or a crab, who prioritizes the accumulation of wealth over the safety and sanity of his employees. That is a story as old as the Mississippi. It is the American dream, reduced to a burger stand under the sea. The evolution of the joke. What does it say about the year 1999 that we have elevated this porous protagonist to the status of a national icon? I suspect it is a reaction to the fin de siècle anxiety I mentioned before. When you are half convinced that the computers are going to eat your bank account at midnight on New Year's Eve, there is something comforting about a show where the greatest problem is a lost spatula or a grumpy neighbor. The humor is surreal. In my time, humor was grounded in the incongruous. You took a real situation and pushed it just far enough to make it funny. You told a story about a man who was so lazy, he hired a boy to do his breathing for him. It was a lie, but it was a lie based on a recognizable human failing. But SpongeBob is a lie based on nothing. It is pure nonsense. It is the realization that the world has become so complex, so wired and so frantic that the only way to cope is to dive into a world where a sponge can be a chef and a squirrel can live in a glass dome and practice karate. Did I mention the squirrel? There is a squirrel from Texas who lives in an airlocked tree. I believe she is the only one in the show who understands the scientific method, which naturally makes her an outsider. The children of 1999 have a threshold for the absurd that far exceeds anything I encountered in the 1800s. We used to worry about the logic of the plot. These children don't want logic. They want a vibe. They want colors that make their retinas ache, and a theme song that stays in their head like a persistent case of the mumps. I tried to explain the plot of an episode to a friend of mine, a fellow who still believes that a joke requires a setup and a punchline. So, I said, the sponge and the starfish find a magic conch shell, and they decide to sit in the middle of a kelp forest and do absolutely nothing until the shell tells them otherwise. They eventually nearly starve to death, all while a forest ranger falls out of the sky. My friend looked at me with the pity one reserves for a man who has been kicked in the head by a mule. "And where is the humor, Mark?" "The humor," I replied, "is in the fact that it doesn't matter. The humor is that the world is a pineapple, and we are all just trying to flip our burgers before the tide comes in." The verdict of the porous. I shall never truly understand SpongeBob SquarePants, just as I shall never truly understand the BlackBerry or the Euro. I am a man of the 19th century, where a sponge was something you used to wipe a slate or wash a dog. To see it transformed into a cultural hero is a reminder that I am a traveler in a land whose language I only half speak. But I will say this for the lad. He has a magnificent heart. In a year of Y2K panics, Matrix simulations, and Napster rebellions, SpongeBob is the only one who seems to be having any fun. He doesn't care about the zeros and ones. He doesn't care about the red pill. He just wants to catch some jellyfish and be the best fry cook in Bikini Bottom. There is a certain dignity in that. If the world is indeed going to end at the stroke of midnight, perhaps we should all take a lesson from the sponge. We should put on our best square trousers, find a dim-witted friend to sit with, and laugh at the sheer glorious absurdity of it all. I may not get the jokes, and I may find the theme song to be a form of auditory torture, but I can respect a fellow who can maintain his optimism while living in a piece of fruit. In the end, we are all just porous creatures trying to soak up as much life as we can before someone squeezes us dry. I'm off to find a Krabby Patty. I've heard they're delicious, though I suspect the secret formula is just a bit of salt and a lot of marketing. But then again, isn't that true of everything in 1999? Chapter 9. The Bluetooth Whisper. In my day, if you wanted to send a message without using your vocal cords, you relied on the telegraph, a magnificent clattering contraption that required a web of copper wires stretched across the continent like a giant metallic spiderweb. It was a visible, tangible system. You could see the poles, you could hear the hum of the electricity, and if a cow leaned too heavily against a post in Nebraska, the news from New York simply stopped until someone went out and had a stern word with the cow. It was a sensible arrangement. But as I drift through the closing months of 1999, I find that humanity has developed a morbid obsession with the invisible. They have released a specification called Bluetooth 1.0, and they are heralding it as the dawn of a world without wires. Now, on the surface, wireless sounds like a grand improvement. I have spent a significant portion of my life tripping over lamp cords and getting my legs tangled in the various tetherings of modern convenience. But the Bluetooth promise is something else entirely. It is the idea that our machines, our telephones, our computers, our toasters, and our laundry irons should be able to whisper to one another through the ether, conducting private conversations behind our backs without the courtesy of a single copper strand to show us what they're up to. The Viking with the rotten tooth. The first thing that strikes a man of letters about this technology is its name. I am told it is named after a 10th century Viking king, Harold Bluetooth Gormson. Apparently, Harold was famous for two things: uniting the disparate tribes of Denmark and Norway, and possessing a tooth that had turned a permanent necrotic shade of blue. I find this to be a fascinating choice for a marketing department. If I were trying to sell a revolutionary high-tech method of communication, I don't believe my first instinct would be to name it after a medieval barbarian with questionable dental hygiene. Why not name it after Mercury, the fleet-footed messenger of the gods? Or perhaps something evocative of the wind? No. The engineers of 1999 looked at their flickering screens and said, "Let us name this invisible magic after a man who likely smelled of salt fish and died from a spear to the ribs." They say it is because Harold united the people, just as Bluetooth will unite our devices. It is a charming sentiment, but I suspect the real reason is that engineers have a very peculiar sense of humor and a deep-seated desire to see a CEO in a $5,000 suit forced to say the word Bluetooth with a straight face during a board meeting. The Secret Society of Appliances. The specification of Bluetooth 1.0 is a document of such staggering complexity that it would make a patent lawyer weep with joy. It describes a world where devices engage in something called a handshake. Think of it. Your cellular telephone approaches your computer. They do not speak out loud. They do not beep. Instead, they engage in an invisible electronic ritual. They exchange protocols. They sniff each other's frequencies. They decide in a fraction of a second whether they are compatible. I find this deeply unnerving. If my typewriter and my desk lamp start handshaking while I'm trying to nap, I should like to be informed of the nature of their agreement. Are they conspiring to run out of ink and oil at the same time? Are they discussing my late-night habits? In 1999, we are surrounding ourselves with a silent, gossiping cabal of plastic servants. We are told that this will lead to seamless integration, a phrase that sounds like something a tailor says right before he overcharges you for a suit. But I see it for what it is: the end of human privacy. In the old days, if your carriage lost a wheel, it didn't tell the stable master until you arrived and shouted at him. Now, I suspect that within a decade, if a man's refrigerator notices he is low on eggs, it will secretly tell his grocery store, which will tell his bank, which will tell his doctor, and before the poor fellow has even felt a hunger pang, he will receive a bill for a dozen grade A large and a lecture on his cholesterol. The man who talks to the air. The most visible, or rather audible, manifestation of this Bluetooth business is the headset. I saw a man walking down Broadway yesterday who appeared to be in the throes of a very animated, very aggressive conversation with a brick wall. He was gesturing wildly, shouting about quarterly projections and leveraging assets, yet there was not another soul within 20 feet of him. In 1880, such a man would have been kindly escorted to the nearest sanitarium and given a soothing glass of warm milk and a very long nap. But in 1999, he is simply a professional. Upon closer inspection, I noticed a small, glowing blue insect attached to his ear. He wasn't talking to the wall, he was talking to a man in Chicago through a piece of jewelry. This, to me, is the true tragedy of the wireless age. We have destroyed the crazy man baseline. We can no longer tell who is suffering from a genuine delusion and who is simply conducting a conference call. We have turned the public square into a cacophony of one-sided arguments. Silence, which used to be the default state of a sidewalk, has become a rare and precious commodity. There is a certain dignity in holding a telephone to one's ear. It is a signal to the world. Pardon me, I am currently engaged in a private matter. It is a physical gesture that commands respect. But the Bluetooth headset removes the gesture. It leaves the man looking like he is merely shouting his internal monologue at the pigeons. It is a loss of decorum that I find hard to stomach. The buggy reality of version 1.0. Of course, the specification and the reality are two very different animals. I am told that Bluetooth 1.0 is about as reliable as a riverboat pilot who has spent too much time in the whiskey barrel. Devices handshake, but then they refuse to let go. They find each other, but then they immediately forget who they were talking to. The range is supposed to be 10 meters, but if you put a piece of paper or a particularly thick ham sandwich between the two devices, the connection vanishes like a politician's promise after an election. I watched a tech expert try to connect his laptop to a printer using this invisible Viking magic. He clicked his buttons. He waited. He clicked them again. He stood on one leg. He moved the laptop 3 inches to the left. He muttered words that would have made a pirate blush. After 45 minutes of synchronizing, he finally gave up, reached into his bag, and pulled out a wire. The relief on his face when the wire clicked into place was a beautiful thing to behold. It was the return of certainty. It was the physical confirmation that A was connected to B. This is the great paradox of 1999. We are spending billions of dollars to replace a 6-inch piece of copper that costs 3 cents and never fails, with an invisible radio frequency system that requires a PhD to operate and works only when the moon is in the correct phase and the wind is blowing from the southeast. We are obsessed with convenience, yet we are willing to work 3 times as hard to achieve it. We want to be free from wires, yet we are becoming more tethered than ever to the troubleshooting manual. The ghost of Harold Bluetooth. As I sit here, I cannot help but wonder if King Harold is watching us from the great hall of Valhalla, laughing his Bluetooth off. He united Norway and Denmark with a sword and a strong will. We are trying to unite a phone and a keyboard with a frequency-hopping spread spectrum. I fear that Bluetooth is just the beginning. Soon, everything will be smart. The walls will be listening. The floors will be sensing our footsteps, and the very air will be thick with the invisible whispers of machines discussing our shortcomings. I, for one, shall cling to my wires. I like a wire. It is honest. It is direct. It tells you exactly where the information is going and who is responsible for getting it there. If I want to talk to someone, I shall do them the courtesy of holding a device to my face so they know I'm not just losing my mind. And if my toaster ever tries to handshake with my kettle, I shall take a hammer to them both. I have enough trouble keeping track of the people in my life. I refuse to be outmaneuvered by my kitchenware. The Bluetooth Whisper is a siren song promising a world of effortless connection. But as any sailor can tell you, the problem with a siren song isn't the melody. It's the rocks you hit while you're listening to it. In 1999, we are sailing straight for the rocks, and we're doing it with our hands behind our backs and a glowing blue bug in our ears. God help us when version 2.0 arrives. Chapter 10. The Blair Witch Marketing. I have always maintained that a lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is still putting on its boots. In my day, if you wanted to propagate a high-quality falsehood, you had to work for it. You had to plant a petrified giant in a farmer's field, hire a few shills to whisper in the local saloon, and wait for the newspapers to catch the scent. It was a manual, laborious craft, akin to carving a statue out of granite with a teaspoon. But in the year of our Lord 1899, the second one, mind you, humanity has invented a tool for the distribution of bunkum that makes my old methods look like a child's game of telephone. I refer to the internet, and more specifically, to a cinematic swindle of such magnificent proportions that it has turned 3 college students with a shaky camera into the most famous missing persons in history. The film is called The Blair Witch Project, but the film itself is merely the tale of the dog. The marketing is the dog itself, and that dog has been barking at the world's door all summer long, convincing everyone that a bit of fiction is a cold, hard fact. The gospel of the website. I have seen many humbugs in my time. I remember when P.T. Barnum convinced the public that a shriveled monkey torso sewn to a fishtail was a Fiji mermaid. It was a grand lie, but it required the physical presence of the audience. You had to go to the museum, pay your nickel, and look the mermaid in its glass eye. In 1999, the lie comes to you. It enters your home through the glowing wires of your computer. The architects of this Blair Witch business created something called a website. They didn't use it to tell you the film was coming to a theater near you. No, they used it to host police reports, missing person posters, and interviews with grieving parents. They presented the story of 3 young filmmakers who vanished in the woods of Maryland as if it were a tragedy unfolding in real time. They understood a fundamental truth about the human animal. We are remarkably eager to believe the worst, provided it is presented with enough bureaucratic boredom. If you tell a man there is a witch in the woods, he will laugh at you. But if you show him a PDF of a Maryland State Police report and a blurry photograph of a discarded backpack, he will pack his bags and prepare for a funeral. I sat before the screen and scrolled through the timeline of the search. I saw the found footage being analyzed by experts. I saw the history of the Blair Witch, a series of murders and disappearances dating back to the 18th century. It was a masterpiece of world building, a phrase the moderns use to describe a lie so detailed that you can't find the exit. I must confess, I felt a pang of professional jealousy. If I'd had a website in 1885, I could have convinced the world that Huckleberry Finn was currently being hunted by a federal task force along the banks of the Ohio. I could have sold 1 million more copies just by posting a bounty notice on the World Wide Web. These Blair Witch fellows have realized that in the information age, the best way to hide a secret is to put it in plain sight and label it classified. The cult of the shaky camera. Then came the film itself. The public, having been whipped into a state of hysterical belief by the internet, flocked to the theaters to see the recovered footage. Now, I have traveled on many a bucking steamboat during a gale. I have ridden in stagecoaches over the rutted roads of the Nevada Territory. I am no stranger to motion that makes the stomach contemplate an early retirement. But I have never experienced anything quite like found footage cinema. The camera in this movie is held by one of the actors, a young woman named Heather, who appears to be having the worst camping trip in the history of the outdoors. She runs, she screams, she points the camera at the dirt, and she points it at the trees. She never, under any circumstances, holds the camera still. The result is a visual experience that can only be described as nausea with a plot. I watched an entire theater of people who had paid $8 for the privilege, slowly turn the color of an unripe lime. By the 40-minute mark, the man sitting next to me was clutching the armrests as if he were aboard the Titanic and the icebergs were gaining on us. It is a stroke of genius. The filmmakers realize that if you make the audience feel physically ill, they will mistake the motion sickness for tension. If they can't see what's happening, they will assume something terrifying is just off screen. It is the first time in history that a lack of cinematography has been hailed as a revolutionary artistic choice. In my day, if an actor couldn't keep the stage in focus, we'd tell him to sober up. In 1999, we give him a $1 million distribution deal. The horror of the pile of sticks. The most impressive part of the Blair Witch swindle is what doesn't happen. In a modern horror movie, one usually expects to see a monster with too many teeth, a man in a hockey mask, or at the very least, a ghost that can throw a piano. But the Blair Witch provides none of these things. The horror consists of a pile of rocks. Our heroes wake up and find 3 piles of stones outside their tent. They are terrified. I found this confusing. In my youth, 3 piles of stones was called a good start on a fence. Some bundles of sticks. They find little twig men hanging from the trees. Again, they scream as if they've found the devil's own ledger. I have seen more terrifying things in a damp woodpile after a rainstorm. A lost map. The most frightening scene involves the 3 students realizing they are lost because they dropped their map in a creek. It is a profound commentary on the 1999 human. We are so removed from nature, so tethered to our GPS systems and our paved roads, that the idea of being in the woods without a map is a fate worse than death. The witch is not a supernatural entity. She is simply the realization that the average college student couldn't find his way out of a paper bag if the directions weren't posted on a website. And yet, it works. The audience was terrified. Why? Because the internet told them they should be. They weren't watching a movie. They were witnessing a document. The film ends with a young man standing in a corner of a basement while Heather screams and the camera falls to the floor. No witch, no blood, just a man in a corner, and the audience left the theater in a state of shock, convinced they had seen something forbidden. The prophet of the lie. The numbers, however, are the truly frightening part. The film cost about $60,000 to make, roughly the price of a decent house in a respectable neighborhood. It has made over $200 million. That is not a profit margin, that is a miracle. It is the ultimate proof that in the digital age, the product is irrelevant. The narrative is everything. If you can control the story, if you can make people believe that the lie is true, you can sell them a 90-minute video of a woman crying into her nose, and they will call it a masterpiece. I sat in my room and reflected on the Blair Witch effect. We are entering a millennium where the line between real and rendered is being permanently erased. If we can be fooled by a few twig men and a clever website, what else can we be talked into? If the information age allows anyone with a camera and a modem to manufacture a reality, how will we ever know what is true again? I suspect that the Blair Witch is just the beginning. Soon, every politician, every corporation, and every man with a grudge will have his own found footage. We shall live in a world of constant competing truths, each one supported by its own police reports and expert interviews. It is a magnificent, terrifying time to be a liar. As for me, I think I shall stay out of the woods, not because I'm afraid of the witch, but because I'm afraid I might run into a group of film students who want to show me their rocks. I have seen enough shaky footage to last me until the next millennium rolls around. If I'm going to be fooled, I'd like it to be by something with a bit more style, like a riverboat gambler with a marked deck or a preacher promising me a front row seat in heaven. At least those lies don't make me want to lose my lunch. The Blair Witch is the ghost of the Internet, and she is haunting the end of the century. She has proven that in 1999, the truth is not out there. It's whatever you can convince 1 million people to click on. Chapter 11. The Loss of the Prince. The Americans are a peculiar and contradictory lot. We spent 8 years of a bloody, musket-riddled revolution to rid ourselves of King George and his gilded nonsense, declaring to the heavens that all men are created equal. We spent the next 2 centuries patting ourselves on the back for our democratic grit, and yet we have spent every waking moment since that victory searching for a replacement for the royalty we threw out. It seems the human heart, no matter how much it loves liberty, has a secret, sneaking desire to bow to someone whose teeth are whiter and whose pedigree is longer than its own. In the July of 1999, the Republic found itself in a state of mourning that would have baffled a Roman emperor, all because a young man with a famous name and a small airplane disappeared into the Atlantic fog. I speak of John F. Kennedy, Jr., the Prince of Camelot. The American Paradox: Royalty without a crown. I have observed that in America we do not crown our kings. We merely wait for them to be born into the right family, and then we never let them have a private moment for the rest of their natural lives. The Kennedys are our Bourbons, our Stuarts, our Habsburgs, but with better hair and a much more efficient public relations department. To the average citizen of 1999, John, a name he apparently loathed, which naturally meant the public used it with reckless abandon, was not a mere mortal. He was a symbol. He was the toddler saluting his father's casket in 1899 minus 36. He was the most beautiful man alive, according to the glossy magazines. He was the editor of a magazine called George, which attempted to make politics as interesting as a fashion show, a task that is as doomed to failure as trying to teach a pig to sing opera. When his plane vanished off the coast of Martha's Vineyard, the information age did not merely report the news. It inhaled the tragedy, chewed on it for 24 hours a day, and exhaled a thick, suffocating cloud of sentimentality. The anatomy of the curse. The newspapers immediately began to dust off their favorite phrase, the Kennedy curse. Now, I have a great respect for a good superstition. I've seen men refuse to board a boat because a black cat looked at them sideways, and I've known miners who wouldn't enter a shaft if they dreamt of a white mule. But the Kennedy curse is a unique piece of American folklore. It suggests that the heavens have a personal vendetta against a single family in Massachusetts. If you look at the facts with the cold eye of a Missouri lawyer, however, the curse looks remarkably like a combination of high-speed machinery and a total lack of fear. The Kennedys do not die in their beds of old age. They die in airplanes, in fast cars, and in the crosshairs of history. To call it a curse is to give a supernatural name to the fact that when you live life at a gallop, the horse is eventually going to stumble. John Jr. was a man who enjoyed the thrill of the wind. He was a pilot with a brand-new license and a broken ankle, flying a complex machine into a hazy night, where the horizon disappears and the sky and the sea become a single, indistinguishable shade of ink. In my day, if a man tried to navigate a steamboat through a thick fog with a bum leg and no landmarks, we wouldn't call his inevitable collision with a sandbar a curse. We'd call it bad piloting. But 1999 is not an age of logic. It is an age of narrative, and the narrative demanded a tragedy of Shakespearean proportions. The 24-hour wake. I sat before the television and watched as the news anchors, men who appear to have had their faces carved from mahogany and their empathy tuned by a committee, competed to see who could look the most heartbroken. They showed the footage of the salute over and over. They interviewed friends of the family who hadn't spoken to the man in 15 years. They hired aviation experts to explain spatial disorientation, a fancy term for when a man's inner ear tells him he is flying level while he is actually spiraling into the drink. The public reaction was a phenomenon that would have fascinated a student of mob psychology. People who had never met the man, who had never even seen him in person, were weeping in the streets. They piled flowers outside his apartment in New York until the sidewalk looked like a florist's warehouse had exploded. It was a national grief, but as I watched, I couldn't help but wonder, what were they grieving exactly? Were they grieving the man? Perhaps. By all accounts, he was a decent fellow, far more humble than his position required and possessed of a genuine kindness. But I suspect they were grieving something else. They were grieving the idea of him. They were grieving the last link to a version of America that felt glamorous, hopeful, and untarnished. A Camelot that probably never existed anywhere but in the filtered memories of the middle-aged. In 1999, with the millennium bug ticking in the background and the Matrix making everyone doubt their own senses, the loss of a prince felt like the loss of a tether to the ground. If even the most beautiful, most favored son of the Republic could be swallowed by the sea, what hope was there for the rest of us in our cubicles? The burial at sea. The end of the saga was as dramatic as any playwright could imagine. The Navy was called in. The wreckage was found. And then, in a move that I found surprisingly dignified, the family opted, for a burial at sea. There is something ancient and honest about the sea. It doesn't care about your family name, your magazine circulation, or how well you look in a swimsuit. It takes what it takes and keeps its secrets. By returning the prince to the water, the Kennedys managed to rob the paparazzi of their final prize. There would be no tomb to be photographed, no marble monument for the tourists to gawk at. Just the gray Atlantic and the silence. I walked down to the water's edge myself that week. I looked out at the horizon and thought about the young man. He had lived his entire life in a fishbowl, being scrutinized by a nation that treated his every haircut as a matter of national security. Perhaps, in the end, the sea was the only place big enough to hold him where he could finally be left alone. The lesson of the pedestal. The loss of the prince left America feeling a bit older, a bit more tired, and a bit more cynical. We realized that our royalty is just as fragile as our commoners. We realized that a famous name is no shield against the laws of physics. But did we learn our lesson? Did we decide to stop building pedestals for people whose only accomplishment was being born? Of course not. Within a week, the magazines were already looking for the next prince, the next it girl, the next vessel for our collective fantasies. We are a nation that claims to hate the crown, but we will spend our last dollar for a glimpse of the jewels. We are a republic of citizens who secretly wish we were a court of subjects. I returned to my desk, my cigar ash falling onto the morning paper. The headline was already moving on to something else. The TiVo, or the London Eye, or some other new gadget designed to distract us from our own mortality. The prince was gone. Camelot was closed for renovations, and the rest of us were left here on the shore, clutching our George magazines and wondering why the fog feels so much thicker than it used to. It is the American way. We build our idols out of gold and starlight, and then we are shocked when they turn out to be made of the same dust and water as the rest of us. But as long as there are cameras to film the fall and newspapers to sell the grief, we shall continue to crown our princes and mourn their passing with all the enthusiasm of a town that has nothing better to do. I shall miss the lad, in a way. He was a bright spot in a very gray year. But I suspect the Kennedy curse will continue to be a bestseller as long as there are Kennedys brave enough to fly and a public hungry enough to watch them crash. Chapter 12. The TiVo Pause. Time, as the poets and the more expensive varieties of theologians like to tell us, is a river. It flows in one direction, it waits for no man, and if you happen to fall asleep on the bank, you cannot expect the water to stop and wait for you to finish your nap. For the entirety of human history, this has been the one immutable law of the universe. If you missed the sunset, you had to wait for the next one. If you missed the moment your mother-in-law fell off the porch, you had to rely on the unreliable eyewitness testimony of the neighbors. But in the year 1899 plus 100, man has finally committed the ultimate act of hubris. He has invented a small black blinking box called TiVo, and with it, he has done the impossible. He has put a leash on time itself. The death of the synchronous soul. Before the arrival of this digital wizardry, the television was a cruel and demanding master. It operated on a schedule, a document of such rigid authority that it made the laws of the Medes and Persians look like a collection of casual suggestions. If your favorite program began at 8 o'clock, you had to be in your chair at 8 o'clock. If the telephone rang, you ignored it. If the house caught fire, you calculated whether the blaze would reach your armchair before the final credits rolled. Life was synchronized. The entire nation watched the same flickering shadows at the same moment. We were a collective, breathing in unison with the broadcast signal. But TiVo, the first digital video recorder, has shattered this communal harmony. It has granted every citizen the power of a private deity. It has introduced the pause button to live existence. I sat in a modern parlor recently and watched a man perform this miracle. He was watching a football game, a sport that involves 22 men in plastic armor colliding with one another for the sake of a pigskin bladder, when his wife entered the room to ask a question about the evening's brisket. In any other era, this would have resulted in a domestic dispute of the highest order. But the man simply pointed a plastic wand at the box and pressed a button. And the world froze. The athletes were suspended in midair. The shouting crowd became a silent photograph. The clock on the screen stopped its frantic countdown. The man turned to his wife, discussed the brisket with the calm of a philosopher, and then, with another click, invited the universe to resume its business. I find this profoundly disturbing. If we can pause the live world, what is to stop us from pausing everything else? We are developing a temporal entitlement. We are becoming a race of people who believe that the sun should wait behind a cloud if we happen to be in the middle of a particularly good book. We are losing the ability to live in the now, because we know we can always store the now in a hard drive and look at it on Tuesday. The great commercial tax evasion. But the true genius of TiVo, and the reason it is currently causing the merchant princes of Madison Avenue to break out in a cold, oily sweat, is its ability to skip. For decades, the commercial has been the tax we pay for our entertainment. In exchange for watching a drama about doctors with troubled love lives, we agree to sit through 3 minutes of a man shouting at us about the miraculous properties of a new laundry soap, or the necessity of purchasing a car that can go 100 miles an hour in a school zone. It is a social contract. The advertiser pays for the show, and we pay with our sanity. TiVo has effectively legalized universal tax evasion. It allows the viewer to fast forward through the shouting. I watched as the laundry soap man was reduced to a frantic, silent blur, his mouth opening and closing like a landed trout as he sped past at 10 times the speed of light. It was a beautiful sight. To see a salesman rendered impotent by a thumb click is a pleasure I would have paid a great deal for back in the 1870s. However, I suspect this will lead to a dark future. If the advertisers cannot force us to watch their messages, they will simply hide the messages inside the stories. Soon, the hero of the play will not merely be a doctor. He will be a doctor who constantly pauses to tell the nurse how much he enjoys the crisp, refreshing taste of a particular brand of ginger ale. We shall be surrounded by product placement, a subtle form of brainwashing that makes the old-fashioned shouting man look positively honest by comparison. The machine that knows your soul. Then there is the matter of the suggestions. TiVo is not merely a recorder. It is a spy. It watches what you watch. It keeps a ledger of your tastes, your whims, and your late-night weaknesses. It learns you. I am told that if you record enough programs about steam engines, the TiVo will eventually conclude that you are a man of mechanical interests and will begin to record other shows about steam engines without your permission. It is a machine that attempts to be your butler, but it has the personality of a stalker. "Mr. Twain," the machine seems to say, "I noticed you enjoyed that documentary on the history of the fork. I have taken the liberty of recording 16 hours of footage regarding the evolution of the spoon. I thought you might find it relevant to your interests." I find this to be an intolerable intrusion. A man's tastes are a private matter, often contradictory and occasionally embarrassing. Some nights I wish to study the works of the great philosophers. Other nights I wish to watch a show about a dog that can play the piano. I do not want a black box in my living room building a profile of my soul based on a moment of intellectual weakness. What happens when the TiVo decides it knows me better than I know myself? What happens when it starts refusing to record what I want because it thinks I need something else? We are handing over the keys to our curiosity to an algorithm, a mathematical ghost that believes a human being is nothing more than a collection of viewing habits. The peril of the infinite pause. The 1999 human believes that TiVo has given him more time. "I can save an hour a day by skipping the commercials," he cries, his eyes bright with the hope of efficiency. But I have lived long enough to know that saved time is a phantom. No one ever saves time and then uses it to write a symphony or learn a new language. They simply use the saved time to watch more television. They use the pause to go to the kitchen and get more snacks so they can sit for another 3 hours in front of the flickering light. We are becoming a time-shifted society. We are living in a world of echoes. We don't watch the news, we watch the recorded news. We don't experience the event, we experience the replay. We are constantly pausing our lives to check our messages, to rewind a conversation, or to schedule a future that we will probably end up fast-forwarding through anyway. I warn you, if you pause the world long enough, you will eventually realize that you don't actually want to see the ending. The lived quality of life is what gives it its sting and its flavor. The knowledge that a moment is passing and will never return is the only thing that makes the moment worth having. If I could have paused my life on the Mississippi, I might still be there, frozen in the golden light of a summer afternoon, watching a snag in the water that never moves. It would be a beautiful picture, but it wouldn't be a life. A life is the movement. A life is the current. TiVo is a magnificent toy, a triumph of the zeros and ones, but it is also a trap. It offers us the illusion of control over a force that cannot be controlled. We are like children playing with a stopwatch, thinking we have conquered the sun because we can make the hands stop moving for a minute. I shall use the pause button sparingly. I prefer my time to flow at its natural pace, commercials and all. There is a certain honesty in the interruption. It reminds you that you are a consumer in a material world, and it gives you a moment to go outside and look at the actual stars, which, as far as I can tell, do not have a fast-forward feature. Heaven help us if they ever do. Chapter 13. The London Eye. As the year 1899 plus 100 drags its weary bones toward the finish line, the city of London has decided to celebrate the arrival of the new millennium by erecting a monument that perfectly encapsulates the human condition, A giant, expensive circle that goes absolutely nowhere. They call it the London Eye, or the Millennium Wheel. I have spent a great deal of my life observing the British, a race of people who possess the unique ability to maintain a stiff upper lip while their umbrella is being inverted by a gale. And I must say, this is their masterpiece. It is a bicycle wheel for a god, or perhaps a very large, very slow-moving steering wheel for a continent that isn't quite sure which way it wants to turn. The ghost of Chicago's ambition. I have a history with wheels. I remember the year 1893 when a fellow named George Ferris unveiled his Great Wheel at the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. It was a monster of iron and hubris, designed to out-Eiffel the French and prove that American engineering could produce something just as useless and twice as heavy as a Parisian tower. The Ferris wheel was a marvel of the industrial age. It clanked, it groaned, and it carried 36 wooden carriages, each the size of a trolley car, filled with people who were willing to pay 50 cents to be terrified by the prospect of a structural failure. It was a statement of power. It said, "We have conquered steel, we have conquered gravity, and we have conquered the fear of being stranded 200 feet above a stockyard." But the London Eye is a different breed of cat. It is a product of the information age, which means it doesn't clank. It whirs. It doesn't have wooden cars. It has pods. Glass-enclosed capsules that look like the escape pods from the Matrix, or perhaps a collection of very large transparent eggs laid by a mechanical swan. The British have placed this wheel on the south bank of the Thames, directly across from the Houses of Parliament. It is a subtle and perhaps unconscious bit of satire. On one side of the river, you have the politicians who go in circles for a living while accomplishing nothing. And on the other side, you have a giant machine that does the exact same thing, but at least has the decency to offer a nice view of the city while it's at it. The engineering of the invisible. The construction of the Eye has been a spectacle of its own. Because London is a city built on top of other cities, and the mud of the Thames has the consistency of a very old pudding, they couldn't simply stand the wheel up. They had to build it lying down flat over the river and then pull it into a vertical position using a series of cables and a great deal of prayer. I watched the great lift on the news. It was a process that moved with the agonizing deliberation of a glacier. They pulled it up a few inches an hour. The British public stood on the bridges, watching a giant bicycle wheel slowly rise out of the muck. And they did what they always do. They complained about the weather and waited for the pub to open. There is something fundamentally 1999 about the Eye. It is 135 meters tall, making it the tallest observation wheel in the world. A record, I suspect, will be broken by a disgruntled billionaire in Dubai or Las Vegas before the next decade is out. But it isn't just about height. It is about observation. In the old days, we went up to feel the wind. We went up to see the horizon. But in 1999, we go up to observe. The pods are air-conditioned. They are stabilized by a computer system that ensures the floor stays level no matter where you are on the circle. You are insulated from the world. You are in a controlled environment, looking at an uncontrolled world through 2 inches of reinforced glass. It is the ultimate expression of the modern desire to experience the universe without actually having to touch it. The pace of the snail. The most remarkable feature of the London Eye is its speed. It moves at approximately 0.6 miles per hour. To put this in perspective, a determined garden snail could outrun the London Eye if it had a decent breakfast and a tailwind. The wheel moves so slowly that it never actually has to stop to let people on or off. You simply step onto the moving platform and enter your pod, much like a confused ant stepping onto a slow-turning record player. I find this pace to be a magnificent commentary on the progress of our century. We have invented jet planes that can cross the ocean in a few hours. We have invented the Internet, which can move a thought across the globe in a heartbeat. And yet, for our grandest millennium celebration, we have built a machine that moves slower than a Victorian funeral procession. "Why so slow?" I asked a gentleman in a bowler hat who was standing near the site. "So, you can take in the vista, Mr. Twain," he replied, puffing on a pipe that smelled of damp leaves and tradition. "It's about the journey, not the destination." "Sir," I said, "in the case of a Ferris wheel, the journey is the destination. You end up exactly where you started. If you move any slower, the passengers will begin to evolve into a different species before they reach the summit." But he didn't care. He was British. He liked the idea of a slow, inevitable movement that leads back to the beginning. It is the history of the British Empire in a nutshell, a grand, sweeping arc that eventually returns to a small island and a nice cup of tea. The view from the summit. When you reach the top of the Eye, London reveals itself to you like a crumpled map. You can see the dome of St. Paul's, the jagged teeth of the Tower, and the endless winding ribbon of the Thames. You see the past, the stone and the soot of the 19th century clashing with the future, the glass towers and the digital billboards of the 20th. And you realize the great secret of human history. Man's favorite hobby is going in a giant circle just to see where he started. We spent the last 1,000 years fighting wars, inventing religions, discovering continents, and perfecting the art of the steam engine, only to arrive at the end of the millennium and build a giant wheel to look back at the mess we've made. We are obsessed with our own tracks. We want to stand at a height and say, "There, that is where I came from. And look, I am right back here again, only with a better camera and a slightly higher tax bracket." The London Eye is the TiVo of architecture. It allows us to pause the city, to look at it from every angle, to rewind our perspective until we feel we have mastered it. But just like the TiVo, it is an illusion. The city is still moving down there. The river is still flowing. The Millennium Bug is still ticking away in the basements of the banks. The Millennium Dome versus the wheel. I must mention the Eye's sibling, the Millennium Dome, which sits further down the river like a giant discarded umbrella. The dome is the official monument, a vast tent filled with experiences and zones designed by committees to tell us how wonderful the future will be. It is a place of propaganda and plastic, and the British public hates it with a passion that is truly inspiring. But they love the wheel. Why? Because the wheel is honest. It doesn't pretend to be an educational experience. It doesn't try to explain sustainable development or the spirit of the nation. It is just a big, beautiful, pointless circle. It offers a moment of silence and a change of perspective. There is a lesson there for the planners of the world. If you want to celebrate 1,000 years of human achievement, don't build a museum. Build a toy. Don't give us a lecture. Give us a ride. We are, at our core, children who have simply grown too tall for our britches, and nothing delights us more than being lifted up and shown the world as if it were a plaything. The final revolution. As the pods of the London Eye continue their silent, steady rotation, I cannot help but think of the zeros again. We are about to enter a new century, a new millennium, a new turn of the wheel. We think we are moving forward. We think the 21st century will be a straight line leading to the stars. But I suspect it will be more like the eye. We shall go up. We shall see some marvelous sights. We shall feel a brief moment of superiority as we look down on the clouds, and then we shall slowly, inevitably, descend back to the muddy bank of the river to see what's for dinner. The London Eye is the perfect monument for 1999 because it is a machine that celebrates the view, not the destination. It is a reminder that in the grand scheme of things, we are all just passengers in a glass egg waiting for our turn at the top, while the great weaver of the universe keeps the wheel turning at 0.6 miles per hour. I shall take a ride on the Eye on New Year's Eve if I can find a ticket. I want to be at the summit when the clocks strike 12. I want to see if the lights of London go out all at once when the bug bites, or if the world just keeps spinning, indifferent to our calendars and our zeros. And if the wheel stops, well, I can think of worse places to spend the end of the world than in a comfortable glass pod with a view of Big Ben. At least I'll be able to see the apocalypse coming before the people on the ground do. The London Eye is watching us, and as I look back at it, I can't help but tip my hat. It's a grand bit of folly, a magnificent waste of steel, and the best seat in the house for the greatest show on earth, the spectacle of humanity, trying to figure out which way is up. Chapter 14. The Mechanical Heart of Lance. I have spent a great deal of my life contemplating the various ways a man can choose to suffer for the sake of a shiny bit of metal or a fleeting mention in the morning papers. In my younger days, I saw men endure the blistering heat of the Nevada silver mines and the soul-crushing boredom of a Missouri Sunday school. But nothing I witnessed in the 19th century can quite compare to the organized, voluntary, and highly aerodynamic agony known as the Tour de France. The Tour is a bicycle race that covers some 2,000 miles of French countryside, a distance that any sensible man would prefer to cover by train, preferably in a first-class carriage with a glass of brandy and a very long novel. But in July of 1999, the world turned its collective gaze toward a young Texan named Lance Armstrong, who decided to traverse this distance on a seat no larger than a pocket dictionary, propelled by nothing but two wheels and a determination that borders on the terrifying. The return of the Texan Phoenix. To understand the fervor surrounding Mr. Armstrong in 1999, one must understand that just 3 years prior, he was not a champion. He was a patient. He had been stricken with a malady so severe that the medical men had essentially begun to measure him for a permanent wooden suit. They found the big Ca in his lungs, his brain, and other delicate quarters of his anatomy that a gentleman usually prefers not to discuss in polite company. But Lance Armstrong did not have the good grace to go quietly into the night. Instead, he treated his cancer as if it were a rival rider trying to pass him on a steep incline. He underwent surgeries that would make a veteran of the Civil War wince, and he subjected himself to chemical treatments that I suspect were brewed in the same vats as industrial-strength paint stripper. And then, in a display of triumph of the will that made the rest of us feel remarkably lazy for taking the elevator, he showed up at the starting line in the Puy de Fou, looking as lean and hungry as a coyote in a hen house. The French versus the cowboy. There's nothing quite so entertaining as watching the French attempt to process an American who refuses to follow their script. The French, as a race, consider a well-dressed salad to be a diplomatic achievement and a 3-hour lunch to be a basic human right. They view their tour as a sacred pilgrimage, a slow, dignified sufferfest through fields of sunflowers and over the jagged peaks of the Alps. Enter Lance. He does not cycle in the traditional poetic sense. He grinds. He has turned his body into a mechanical heart, a high-precision engine fueled by pasta, and a relentless burning desire to humiliate anyone wearing a different colored jersey. I observed the press during the race, and it was a masterpiece of cultural friction. The French media, they looked at Lance's efficiency, his U.S. Postal Service team, and whispered about the machine. They missed the romance of the lone rider suffering in the rain with a baguette strapped to his back. The American media, they treated him as a secular saint. He was the man who beat death, a cowboy on a carbon fiber horse riding into Paris to claim the yellow jersey as if it were a lost bit of Texas territory. I watched him climb the mountains, the Col du Galibier and the Sestriere. In my day, a hill was something you walked up while complaining to your mule, but Lance Armstrong went up those mountains with a cadence so high his legs were a blur, looking for all the world like a man who had forgotten that gravity was a law and not a suggestion. He didn't just win, he dismantled the competition with the cold, methodical precision of a watchmaker. The human as a machine. This brings me to the great philosophical question of 1999. Is the human body merely a machine that can be tuned, oiled, and pushed to the breaking point? In this year of zeros and ones, we have become obsessed with optimization. We want faster computers, smaller phones, and apparently more efficient humans. Lance Armstrong is the pinnacle of this obsession. He has his heart rate monitored, his oxygen intake measured, and his power output calculated in watts, as if he were a light bulb or a steam-powered threshing machine. I find this to be a chilling bit of progress. In my era, a sportsman was a fellow who had a natural talent for hitting a ball or outrunning a dog, and who prepared for a match by having a steak and perhaps a stiff drink. But the modern athlete is a biological engineering project. He is a collection of data points. He lives in a wind tunnel to ensure his ears are sufficiently aerodynamic. I sat back and watched Lance celebrate his victory on the Champs-Élysées. He looked triumphant, yes, but he also looked as if he had been forged in a factory. There was a certain mechanical quality to his joy, a controlled, disciplined satisfaction. It made me wonder, if we can program a man to survive a plague and then ride a bicycle over a mountain range faster than any man in history, what else can we program him to do? And more importantly, is there any room left in his chest for a heart that beats for anything other than a podium finish? The shadow of the supplement. Of course, because this is 1999, And because we are a suspicious race of creatures, the whispers have already begun. The French, having seen their own riders defeated by the postman, have begun to wonder if the mechanical heart is being assisted by something more potent than Texan grit and vitamin C. They talk of doping, a word that implies a man is treating his bloodstream like a laboratory experiment. They search the trash cans of the teams for discarded needles and suspicious vials. They want to believe that his triumph is a cheat. I have no opinion on the matter of his chemistry, as I am not a doctor, nor have I ever been particularly fond of needles. But I do know this: humanity requires a hero, especially as the millennium draws to a close. We need to believe that a man can be broken into 1,000 pieces by fate and then put himself back together, stronger and faster than before. We need the miracle on two wheels. If Lance Armstrong is a lie, he is a magnificent one, a lie told with such conviction and such physical agony that it becomes a kind of truth. He represents the 1999 dream, that we can overcome our biological glitches and upgrade ourselves into something invincible. The final sprint to Paris. As he rode into Paris to claim his first yellow jersey, the city was bathed in a golden light that seemed almost too perfect to be real. The Prince of Camelot was gone, as we discussed in the last chapter, but a new king of the road had arrived. I watched the crowds cheering, their faces alight with the hope that this Texan had discovered the secret to immortality. He stood on the podium, the Arc de Triomphe looming behind him, and he looked out at the new world he had conquered. It was a world that had almost forgotten what it was like to believe in a hero who didn't come from a comic book or a computer simulation. Lance Armstrong gave 1999 a triumph of the will, at a time when we were mostly worried about triumphs of the spreadsheet. He reminded us that the human spirit, or at least the human ego, is the most powerful engine ever designed. I shall stay away from the bicycles myself. I find that 3 wheels are safer than 2, and 4 wheels are better yet, provided there is a horse attached to the front of them. But I can appreciate the grit of the man. He has turned his life into a tall tale that would have made the boys on the Mississippi riverfront drop their whittling and listen in silence. Whether he is a saint, a machine, or merely a very determined Texan with a high tolerance for leg cramps, he has captured the imagination of a dying century. And in 1999, as we wait for the zeros to reset the world, a man who can outrun a tragedy is exactly the kind of ghost we want to believe in. I only hope his mechanical heart doesn't require too much maintenance in the years to come. For when a machine breaks, it is a tragedy of iron. But when a hero breaks, it is a tragedy of the soul. And the 21st century looks like it's going to be very hard on our heroes. Chapter 15. The SETI at Home Search. If there is one trait that defines the human race more than our penchant for war or our inexplicable fondness for wearing neckties, it is our staggering, bottomless capacity for loneliness. We are a species that sits upon a planet teeming with 6 billion of our own kind, each of us vibrating with thoughts, dreams, and the occasional urge to steal a neighbor's newspaper. And yet, we spend our Friday nights staring at the stars and wondering, with a pathetic sort of longing, if there is anyone else out there to talk to. In the May of 1899, plus 100, this cosmic loneliness achieved its most ridiculous technological form yet. It arrived in the shape of a screensaver called SETI at home. Now, in my day, a screensaver was a piece of velvet you draped over a parrot's cage to keep it from swearing at the guests. But in the 1999 parlance, it is a bit of software designed to prevent a computer screen from burning in, a term that implies the machine is so bored by its own existence that it will permanently etch its own desktop onto its glass soul if you don't give it something colorful to look at. SETI at home, however, is a screensaver with a mission. It stands for the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, and its plan for finding a Martian with a story to tell is to harness the idle processing power of millions of home computers. It is the first time in history that a man can feel he is contributing to the advancement of science while he is actually in the kitchen making a sandwich or in the parlor having a nap. The Great Cosmic Beehive. The concept is what the high priests of the information age call distributed computing. I find the phrase to be a bit of linguistic fluff designed to make a very simple idea look like a miracle. Imagine, if you will, a project to build a grand bridge across the Mississippi. In a sensible era, you would hire 1,000 men, buy 1,000,000 tons of steel, and tell them to get to work. But distributed computing suggests that instead, you should send a single splinter of wood to every citizen in the United States and ask them to whittle it into a specific shape while they are waiting for their tea to boil. Eventually, you collect all the splinters, glue them together, and presto, you have a bridge. It is a system that relies on the idea that 1,000,000,000 tiny efforts by 1,000,000,000 tiny minds can equal the genius of a single architect. So it is with SETI, a massive radio telescope in Arecibo, Puerto Rico, a device that looks like a giant metallic soup bowl dropped into a jungle, listens to the hiss of the universe. It records the static of the stars, the burps of distant suns, and the general background noise of the cosmos, which I suspect sounds very much like a Sunday afternoon in a crowded boarding house. Because there is too much noise for any one computer to analyze, the SETI people break the data into work units and mail them out across the internet to the volunteers. I watched a young man participate in this search. He sat before his monitor, and when he stopped typing, the screen transformed into a mesmerizing display of glittering, multicolored graphs. Blue peaks and yellow valleys danced across the black void of the screen as his Pentium II processor chewed through a tiny slice of the galaxy. "What are you doing?" I asked, peering at the flashing lights. "I'm looking for aliens, Mr. Twain," he said, with the solemnity of a man who believes he is about to be the first to hear a hello from Andromeda. If my computer finds a spike in the radio frequency that doesn't look like noise, I send it back to Berkeley, and they check it for intelligence. "And what has your computer found so far?" The lad sighed. "Mostly just a lot of hydrogen and a bit of interference from a microwave oven in San Jose. But tonight could be the night." The vanity of the radio wave. I find the human obsession with radio waves to be a magnificent bit of vanity. We have decided that because we have spent the last 100 years cluttering the atmosphere with telegraph pings, radio dramas, and advertisements for miracle hair growers, the rest of the universe must be doing the same. We assume the aliens are just like us, only perhaps with more eyes and better math. We assume they are out there, sitting in their own versions of 1999, desperately broadcasting their version of The Price is Right. into the void, hoping someone will listen. But what if they are truly intelligent? If I were an alien living on a planet 300 light years away, and I managed to pick up a signal from Earth, say, a broadcast of a political debate from 1960 or a particularly loud commercial for a used car lot in Cincinnati, I would not respond. I would turn off my receiver, lock my planetary doors, and pretend I wasn't home. The search for extraterrestrial intelligence presupposes that if we find it, it will have something interesting to say. But look at our own intelligence. We have the Internet, a tool that can connect every mind on the planet, and we use it to look at photographs of cats and argue with strangers about the Matrix. Why would a creature capable of traveling between the stars want to participate in that conversation? I suspect that if there are aliens out there, they are watching us with the same detached amusement that a biologist watches a particularly frantic colony of ants. They aren't sending us radio waves. They are probably sending us postcards that we are too dim-witted to read. Or perhaps they are just waiting for us to finish our Y2K tantrum before they introduce themselves. The hypnosis of the graphs. But the true genius of SETI at home isn't the search itself. It is the screensaver. We live in an age where the human attention span is being shredded by the 24-hour news cycle and the BlackBerry buzz. We are a frantic, twitchy race, but SETI at home has discovered a way to make a man sit perfectly still for hours on end. He isn't watching a movie. He isn't reading a book. He is watching his computer think. There is a hypnotic quality to those graphs. They represent the invisible. They give a man the feeling that he is connected to the infinite. In the 19th century, if a man wanted to feel connected to the infinite, he went to a mountaintop or sat by a river and contemplated the majesty of God. In 1999, he sits in a cubicle and watches a blue line jitter across a black screen while his hard drive makes a sound like a tiny caffeinated woodpecker. It is science as a hobby. It is the apocalypse as a background task. We are so desperate to find someone, anyone to talk to, that we are willing to hand over our electricity and our processing power to a ghost hunt in the stars. And meanwhile, the person sitting in the next cubicle is a total stranger. We are searching for a signal from a billion miles away because we have lost the signal from the person sitting across the dinner table. The galactic busy signal. As the millennium draws to a close, SETI at home has become a global phenomenon. There are millions of users, all of them hoping to be the one. There is even a leaderboard, a top users list, where you can see who has processed the most work units. It has turned the search for God into a competitive sport. I've processed 300 units this month, a man will boast, as if he has personally cleared the brush from the galactic highway. I'm in the top 1% of the search. I find this to be the most human part of the whole affair. We have taken the vast, terrifying, beautiful silence of the universe and turned it into a game of bingo. We aren't looking for intelligence. We are looking for validation. We want the universe to look at our colorful graphs and say, "Good job, Dave. You found me. Here's your commemorative trophy." I, for one, shall not be participating in the SETI search. I have enough trouble processing the work units of my own mind, a collection of data that is mostly composed of old jokes, regrets, and a lingering desire for a decent sandwich. If the aliens want to talk to me, they know where I am. I am a man of the 19th century. I do not require a radio wave or a distributed computer. I prefer a more traditional form of extraterrestrial intelligence, the kind that comes from a well-written book or a long walk in the woods. But as the zeros of the year 2000 approach, I can see the appeal of the search. If the world is indeed going to end because a computer can't figure out the date, perhaps it's comforting to think that somewhere out there, a more sensible race of creatures is watching our little bug with a sympathetic eye. I can see the alien now looking at his own distributed computer and seeing a spike in the data coming from a small blue planet in the suburbs of the Milky Way. "Look, Zorg," the alien says, pointing at the screen, "the humans are having another existential crisis. They've turned their computers into a giant prayer wheel to find us." "And should we answer?" Zorg asks. The alien looks at a broadcast of the Phantom Menace that has just reached his planet. He sighs, adjusts his antennae, and presses the ignore button. "Not yet," he says. "Let's wait until they get over the Jar Jar business. I don't think they're ready for the truth just yet. I shall stay here on Earth, with my feet on the ground and my eyes on the horizon. If a Martian knocks on my door, I shall invite him in for a cigar and a chat. But until then, I refuse to let my idle processor be used for anything other than my own idle thoughts. The stars have been silent for a long time, and I suspect they are enjoying the peace and quiet. We should probably try to do the same." Chapter 16. The Fight Club Philosophy. I have often observed that when a man has too many problems, he becomes a philosopher. But when a man has no problems at all, he becomes a menace. In the year 1899, the second edition, we have reached a pinnacle of comfort that would have made the kings of old look like paupers. We have climate-controlled rooms, chairs that adjust to the specific curvature of our spines, and a food supply so reliable that the greatest physical danger a man faces is a high-sodium snack. And yet, judging by a moving picture released this autumn called Fight Club, the modern man is absolutely miserable. He is so bored by his own safety, so stifled by his own wallpaper, and so insulted by his own benefits package that he is willing to go into a damp basement and let a total stranger punch him in the nose just to see if he still has blood in his veins. The Gospel of the Swedish Catalog. The protagonist of this tale is a young man who remains nameless, likely because he is intended to represent every poor soul currently trapped in a cubicle, a modern invention that is essentially a soft-carpeted stall for the human animal, designed to prevent the occupant from seeing the sun or his fellow man. This fellow suffers from insomnia, a malady I have always found can be cured by a long walk or a tedious book, but which he attempts to cure by attending support groups for diseases he does not have. He is a man defined not by his character, his deeds, or his lineage, but by his furniture. He spends his evenings poring over a catalog from a Swedish establishment called IKEA, selecting dust ruffles and handcrafted glass bowls with the intensity of a general planning a campaign. The 1999 predicament. What kind of dining set defines me as a person? The 1899 reality. I hope the roof doesn't leak and the wolves don't get the chickens. I found this section of the film to be a magnificent satire. We have become a race of interior decorators. We are no longer citizens. We are consumers. We are slaves to the IKEA nesting instinct. It is a peculiar kind of tragedy when a man's greatest existential fear is that his Clips coffee table doesn't match his Biora floor lamp. We have filled our lives with things only to find that the things have turned around and filled our lives with a hollow plastic dread. The arrival of the soap maker. Into this vacuum of beige living steps a character named Tyler Durden. Tyler is everything the narrator is not. He is charismatic. He is filthy. He lives in a house that appears to be held together by mold and spite. And he possesses a philosophy that makes a pack of wolves look like a sewing circle. Tyler's philosophy is simple. It's only after we've lost everything that we're free to do anything. It is a heady, dangerous idea, the kind of thing that sounds wonderful when you are 24 years old and your boss has just yelled at you about a TPS report, but which looks a bit different when you actually have a mortgage and a pair of shoes you'd like to keep. Tyler believes that the modern world has emasculated the male of the species, turning him into a consumer who is defined by the car he drives or the contents of his wallet. To remedy this, Tyler founds Fight Club. The rules are famous, though I find it a bit ironic that the first two rules are to never talk about it, which has resulted in everyone in America talking about nothing else for the last 3 months. I watched the scenes of the fighting with a mixture of horror and amusement. In my day, a fight was something to be avoided, or at the very least, something that happened because of a disagreement over a card game or a lady's honor. But these men are fighting for no reason at all. They are fighting for the experience. They are hitting each other to feel something. It is the angst of the cubicle turned outward. It is the realization that a life of perfect safety is a life of perfect boredom. We have removed the struggle for survival, so we have been forced to invent a struggle just to keep from going mad. The industrialization of mayhem. But Tyler Durden is not content with a few bloody noses in a basement. He has grander plans. He founds Project Mayhem, turning his legion of bruised followers into a private army of space monkeys. Their goal is the destruction of modern civilization, or at least the destruction of the credit card companies. They wish to reset the world, to blow up the buildings where the digital ledgers of our debts are kept, and return humanity to a state of nature where we hunt elk through the ruins of the shopping malls. I must say, as a man who has lived through a civil war, I find the romanticization of anarchy to be a bit thin. A world without credit cards sounds lovely until you realize it is also a world without penicillin, dentistry, or a reliable supply of cigars. But for the 1999 audience, the idea of a great reset is intoxicating. We are living on the edge of the zeros. We are terrified of the millennium bug. Yet half of us are secretly rooting for the bug to win. We want the machines to fail. We want the screens to go dark. We want to be real again, even if real means being cold, hungry, and covered in bruises. The film is a scream against the numbing of the soul. It is a critique of a world that offers us 1,000 choices of cereal, but no choice in how we live our lives. It is a rebellion against the service industry, where we are all singing, all dancing crap of the world. The soap and the fat. The most deliciously Twain-esque irony in the film involves Tyler's day job. He makes high-end soap. But he doesn't make it from coconut oil or lavender. He makes it from the rendered human fat stolen from the dumpsters of liposuction clinics. Think of it. The wealthy pay thousands of dollars to have their excess fat sucked out of their bodies so they can remain beautiful. Tyler steals that fat, turns it into soap, and sells it back to those same people at $20 a bar to wash their sins away. It is a cycle of excess and vanity that would have made a satirist of the old school weep with joy. It is the ultimate metaphor for 1999. We are literally washing ourselves with our own greed. We are consuming our own waste and calling it luxury. The twist of the mind. I shall not reveal the twist of the film for the 3 people in America who haven't seen it yet, but I will say that it is a profound commentary on the fragmentation of the self. In a world where we spend all day pretending to be someone we are not, polite, efficient, professional, it is only natural that we should eventually develop a second personality who is everything we are afraid to be. The narrator and Tyler Durden are the 2 halves of the modern soul, the one who buys the IKEA furniture and the one who wants to set it on fire. We are all living in a fight club of the mind. We are all struggling to reconcile our desire for comfort with our need for meaning. We want the clips table, but we also want to be the man who doesn't care about the table. I left the theater and looked at the faces of the young men in the lobby. They were standing a bit taller, their jaws set a bit firmer, as if they were all waiting for Tyler Durden to tap them on the shoulder and give them an assignment. They were desperate for a war, a Great Depression, or at least a reason to be angry. Poor lads, I thought. They've been given everything, and they feel like they've been given nothing. The philosophy of Fight Club is a warning. It tells us that you cannot feed the human spirit on a diet of zeros and ones and expect it to remain docile. If you don't give a man a cause, he will find a fight. If you don't give him a story, he will write a manifesto. As we approach the final midnight of the millennium, I suspect Project Mayhem is already underway, though not in the way Tyler Durden imagined. The project is the Internet. The mayhem is the collapse of the old order, and the fighting is just beginning. I think I'll go home and sit on my non-IKEA chair. I have no desire to hit anyone, and I certainly have no desire to blow up a bank, but I will look at my wallpaper with a bit more suspicion than I did yesterday, because if Tyler Durden is right, the things I own might just be starting to own me. And I've always preferred to be the master of my own house, even if the house is just a collection of memories and a few good lies. The first rule of 1999 is, you do not talk about the year 2000. The second rule of 1999 is, you do not talk about the year 2000. But we're going to talk about it anyway. We have 3 months left, and the clock is ticking. I suggest we all enjoy our IKEA furniture while we still can, before someone decides to render us into soap. Chapter 17. The Sega Dreamcast. Sunset. If there is one thing that the human race loves more than a grand success, it is a magnificent, well-intentioned, and utterly doomed failure. We have a soft spot for the underdog, provided the underdog is wearing a sleek white plastic shell and possesses a processing power that defies common sense. in the September of 1899 plus 100, specifically on the 9th day of the 9th month, a date chosen for its mystical symmetry and its ease of remembrance for the remarkably distracted. The Sega Corporation released a machine called the Dreamcast. Now, I have seen many dreams in my time. I have seen the dreams of the 49ers in the California goldfields, which usually ended in a pile of dirt and a very expensive case of scurvy. I have seen the dreams of inventors who believed they had discovered a way to turn lead into gold, only to find they had successfully turned gold into a very large pile of useless lead. But the Sega Dreamcast is a dream of a different sort. It is a dream composed of silicon, light, and a blue hedgehog with an attitude problem. The Gospel of the Nines, 9.9.99. The marketing for this device was a masterpiece of 1999 hyperbole. The date was heralded as if it were the second coming of the steam engine. September 9th, 1999, the advertisement screamed, suggesting that if you didn't have a Dreamcast in your parlor by midnight on that day, you were effectively choosing to live in the Stone Age. I observed the gamers, a new and peculiar tribe of humans who possess thumbs of steel and the dietary habits of a nocturnal raccoon, as they lined up at the shops. They spoke a language that I found entirely impenetrable. They talked of bit rates, polygons, and frames per second. In my day, a polygon was something you studied in a geometry book before throwing the book into the river. But in 1999, a polygon is the building block of reality. The more polygons you have, the more real your dream is. The Dreamcast promised millions of these little devils, all dancing together to create a world that was supposed to be indistinguishable from the one outside the window, only with more explosions and fewer mosquitoes. The soul in the machine. It's thinking. Sega's slogan for the machine was a chilling bit of 1999 psychological warfare. It's thinking. Coming as it did in the midst of the Y2K panic, this was a bold move. Half the country was terrified that their computers were going to stop thinking entirely at the stroke of midnight. And here was Sega, proudly announcing that their toy was developing a mind of its own. I sat before a Dreamcast and watched a game called Sonic Adventure. It featured a blue hedgehog who could run faster than a lightning bolt and possessed a pair of sneakers that appeared to be immune to the laws of friction. I watched as this creature sprinted through a whale lagoon, being chased by a killer whale that was composed of, you guessed it, more polygons than I have ever seen in one place. Is it thinking? I asked a young fellow who was frantically wagging a plastic joystick. It's calculating the physics of the water, Mr. Twain, he shouted, his eyes wide with the digital fever. Look at the ripples. Look at the way the light reflects off the whale's back. It's 128 bits of pure, unadulterated power. I looked at the ripples. They were very nice ripples, to be sure, but I couldn't help but wonder why we have spent billions of dollars to invent a machine that can think about the physics of water, only so that a blue hedgehog can avoid being eaten by a fake whale. We have achieved the pinnacle of human engineering, and we have used it to build a better brand of nonsense. The VMU, a gadget within a gadget. The Dreamcast possessed a controller that was roughly the size and shape of a dinner plate, and tucked inside this plate was a smaller device called a VMU, Visual Memory Unit. This is the ultimate expression of the 1999 obsession with portable data. The VMU was a tiny screen that sat in the middle of your hands, showing you information that was too secret to be put on the main television. It allowed you to play mini games while you were away from your console, effectively ensuring that the human mind is never, even for a single second, forced to contemplate its own existence or the beauty of a sunset. I found the VMU to be a delightful bit of redundancy. It is a machine designed to help you remember what you were doing while you were doing it. It is the digital equivalent of a man carrying a small mirror so he can watch himself walk down the street. It is information for information's sake. The online frontier, the modem in the back. But the true dream of the Dreamcast was the modem. Every machine came equipped with a way to connect to the World Wide Web, allowing a boy in St. Louis to play a game of Phantasy Star Online with a boy in Tokyo. This is the connectivity we have been discussing all year. It is the final collapse of distance. But as I watched these boys interact, I realized that they weren't exchanging ideas or poetry or even recipes for a good stew. They were mostly just killing digital dragons and arguing about whose lag was worse. We have built a global bridge of light and sound, and we are using it to play tag in the dark. It is a magnificent achievement and a total waste of time, all rolled into one white plastic box. The looming shadow, the PlayStation 2. However, even as the Dreamcast launched with its nines and its thinking, there was a shadow growing on the horizon, a shadow named Sony. The rumors of the PlayStation 2 were already circulating like a bad cold. The public, in its infinite fickleness, was already looking past the Dreamcast toward the next dream. They were told that the PlayStation 2 would not just play games, it would play DVDs. It would be the center of the living room. It would possess an emotion engine, a phrase that suggests the machine will not only think, but will eventually fall in love with you and perhaps write you a sonnet if you treat it nicely. I felt a pang of sympathy for Sega. They had built a beautiful, fast, and clever machine. They had brought the arcade into the home. But in the year 1999, being good is not enough. You must be the future. And the public has decided that the future belongs to whoever can promise the most gigaflops and the most multimedia functionality. The Dreamcast is the sunset of a certain kind of innocence. It is the last machine that was just a game machine. After this, everything must be a system. Everything must be a platform. Everything must be a portal to the infinite. The philosophy of the plastic dream. As I sat in the glow of the television, watching the blue hedgehog run his endless race, I realized that the Dreamcast is the perfect metaphor for 1899 plus 100. We are all dreaming. We are dreaming that our computers will save us or that our toys will define us. We are dreaming that if we can just get enough bits and enough polygons, we will finally be happy. The Dreamcast is a magnificent swirling vortex of 1999 energy, ambitious, colorful, slightly confused, and desperately trying to outrun its own obsolescence. It is a machine that thinks, but it doesn't know that its time is almost up. It doesn't know that the zeros are coming, and with them, a new empire that will make the white box look like a relic of the steam age. I shall keep my Dreamcast. I like the way it whirs when it's trying to find the whale. I like the absurdity of the blue hedgehog. And I like the fact that it is a dream that doesn't quite work out in the end. Because that is the most human kind of dream there is. We are a race of dreamcasters. We throw our hopes into the silicon and hope for a miracle. And if the miracle doesn't happen, we just wait for the next version to launch. The sun is setting on Sega, and the emotion engine is warming up. I suggest we all enjoy the nines while we have them. For when the clock strikes 12, the dream will be over, and we'll all have to figure out how to use the DVD player. Chapter 18. The Pokemon Pandemic Reaches Peak. I have lived through the California Gold Rush, where men of supposedly sound mind abandoned their families and their sanity to go scratch at the dirt in search of a yellow metal that primarily serves to make one's teeth look more expensive. I have seen the tulip mania in the history books and the mulberry tree fever in my own backyard. But none of these collective hallucinations can hold a candle or even a damp match to the biological and economic catastrophe that has overtaken the youth of 1899 plus 100. I am speaking of the Pokemon pandemic. It began as a mere flicker in the East, a Japanese export that arrived on our shores with the quiet persistence of a rising tide. But by the autumn of 1999, it has become a full-blown delirium. If you walk past a schoolyard today, you will not see children playing tag or practicing their elocution. You will see rows of small, hunched figures staring into glowing plastic rectangles, their thumbs twitching with the rhythmic intensity of a telegraph operator sending a frantic SOS. The Gospel of the Pocket Monster. To the uninitiated, a group that currently consists of myself and perhaps 3 hermits living in the Ozarks, a Pokemon, a portmanteau of pocket and monster, though pocket-sized obsession would be more accurate, is a colorful creature that lives inside a small red and white ball. There are, at last count, 151 of these beasts. The primary deity of this pantheon is a creature named Pikachu. He is a yellow, rodent-like entity with rosy cheeks and a tail shaped like a lightning bolt. He does not speak any known human tongue. He merely repeats his own name with varying degrees of enthusiasm. In my day, a rat that could only say its own name would be a candidate for a very large trap. But in 1999, he is a global icon, a merchant of joy, and a master of the electrical arts. The premise of the game is deceptively simple and utterly diabolical. You must travel the world, capture these creatures, and train them to fight one another for the sake of your own personal glory. It is a cockfight for the digital age, scrubbed clean of blood and feathers and replaced with bright colors and a catchy theme song. The hardware, the window to the pixels. The medium for this contagion is the Game Boy Color. It is a handheld device roughly the size of a thick sandwich, possessing a screen that glows with the light of 1,000 neon dreams. I observed a lad on a train as he navigated this digital wilderness. He was playing the new editions, Pokemon Gold and Pokemon Silver, which have just been released to the kind of fanfare usually reserved for the return of a conquering hero. These new versions have added another 100 monsters to the list, a move that I can only describe as a masterpiece of capitalistic cruelty. The day/night cycle. The game now knows what time it is in the real world If it is midnight in Missouri, it is midnight in the game. Some monsters only come out at night. This ensures that the modern child has a legitimate reason to stay awake until 3 in the morning, hiding under his covers with a flashlight, searching for an imaginary owl. The breeding. These creatures can now be bred. You take two monsters, leave them at a daycare, and eventually they produce an egg. I've found this to be a remarkably delicate way to explain the mysteries of life to a 10-year-old, though I suspect the children are less interested in the biology and more interested in the stat gains. I asked the lad why he felt compelled to capture every single one of these creatures. He looked at me with a gaze that was both pitying and profoundly tired. "You don't understand, Mr. Twain," he whispered. "I have to catch 'em all. It's the law." The catch 'em all philosophy. Therein lies the genius and the horror of the Pokemon phenomenon. It has turned the human instinct for collection into a fever. In my time, a boy might collect postage stamps or birds' eggs or perhaps the colorful labels from cigar boxes. These were quiet, sedentary hobbies. But catching 'em all is a competitive, high-stakes endeavor. It is a quest that never ends. Every time a child thinks he has completed his collection, the high priests at Nintendo release a new generation, adding more monsters, more evolutions, and more reasons for the child to beg his father for another $20. It is a tall tale that has been turned into an economy. We are no longer trading in gold or silver. We are trading in Charizards and Blastoises. I have seen a man trade his honor for a winning hand of poker, but I have never seen a boy trade his dignity, his dessert, and his favorite marble for a holographic piece of cardboard depicting a fire-breathing lizard. And yet, the Pokemon trading card game has turned every lunchroom in America into a miniature Wall Street, complete with insider trading, market crashes, and the occasional playground brawl over a first edition rarity. The umbilical cord of the digital age, the link cable. The most fascinating aspect of this pandemic is the link cable. This is a physical wire that connects two Game Boys together, allowing two children to trade or battle. I watched two boys engage in this ritual. They sat back to back, tethered together by this gray plastic cord, their faces illuminated by the screens. They were connected, yet they were utterly silent. It was a picture of the 1999 human condition, physically linked by technology, but existing in entirely separate digital universes. The trade itself is a matter of intense negotiation. "I'll give you my haunter for your Kadabra," one said. "Only if you throw in a Pidgeot," the other replied. They were learning the art of the sucker trade at an age when I was still trying to figure out how to tie my own boots. They were learning that value is subjective, that rarity is everything, and that a digital monster can be more precious than a physical friendship. The infantilization of the millennium. What does it say about the end of the century that we have all, adults included, succumbed to this? I have seen grown men in suits carrying Pikachu keychains. I have seen the news anchors discussing the Pokemon movie with the same gravity they used for the Euro or the Balkan conflict. We are entering the infantilization age. In 1899, a 16-year-old was a man, often with a job, a wife, and a burgeoning mustache. In 1999, a 16-year-old is a trainer, trying to evolve his Eevee into a Vaporeon. We are retreating into a world of primary colors and simplified conflicts. We are choosing a world where the greatest tragedy is a fainted monster, and the greatest triumph is a gym badge made of tin. Perhaps it is a defense mechanism. The real world is full of millennium bugs and existential matrices and Project Mayhems. In the world of Pokemon, everything is orderly. If you work hard, you get stronger. If you have the right type, you win the battle. It is a meritocracy that actually works, unlike the one in Washington or on the riverfront. The verdict of the Pokemaster. As I look at the pile of trading cards on my desk, given to me by a fan who insisted I needed a Mewtwo to protect my soul, I cannot help but admire the sheer scale of the humbug. It is a masterpiece of marketing, a symphony of obsession, and a perfect bridge between the analog and the digital. We are a race of hunters and gatherers, and Nintendo has given us a forest that never runs out of prey. We are a race of storytellers, and they have given us 251 characters to name and nurture. I shall not be catching them all myself. I have enough trouble keeping track of my own characters without adding a 100-strong menagerie of pocket-sized nightmares. But I will keep my Pikachu figurine on my mantle. He is the mascot of the end of the world. He is the yellow, smiling face of the Zeros. And if the world does indeed end at midnight on December 31st, I suspect the last thing we see won't be a mushroom cloud or divine judgment. It will be a small glowing screen, a frantic thumb, and a message that says, "A wild 2000 appeared. I only hope we have enough great balls to catch it. For if the next millennium is anything like this one, we're going to need all the imaginary monsters we can get just to keep our sanity." Chapter 19. The Party Like. It's 1999. The year 1899 ended with a quiet sigh, a modest glass of port, and the comforting knowledge that the sun would rise over a world that still smelled primarily of coal smoke and horse manure. We did not feel the need to hire a brass band to usher in the new century. We simply turned the page on the calendar and went back to work. But as I stand upon the precipice of this second 99, I find that humanity has decided to face the future not with dignity, but with a frantic, glittering hysteria that suggests the entire species has collectively decided to jump off a bridge and is currently arguing about who gets to wear the most ridiculous hat on the way down. The unofficial anthem of this madness is a ditty by a gentleman who currently goes by a symbol that looks like a deranged weather vane, but whom the world once knew as Prince. The song is titled, appropriately enough, 1999. It was written nearly 20 years ago, but in this December it has become a mandatory liturgical chant. It commands us to party like it's 1999, under the assumption that 2000 party over, out of time. I find the sentiment to be a masterpiece of nihilistic cheer. It is the philosophy of the condemned man who, upon being told he is to be hanged at dawn, asks if the gallows can be decorated with fairy lights and if the executioner knows how to mix a decent martini. We are out of time, says the song. The Zeros are coming to erase us. Therefore, the only logical response is to put on a purple velvet suit and dance until our knees fail. The industrialization of the final midnight. In my day, a party required a few friends, a fiddle, and a bowl of punch that could take the paint off a barn door. In 1999, a party is a global industrial complex. Every hotel, every restaurant, and every damp basement with a disco ball has increased its prices by 500% for the privilege of standing in a crowded room on December 31st. People are paying thousands of dollars for Millennium packages that include a bottle of average champagne and a commemorative plate. It is the ultimate triumph of the humbug. We are being sold the end of time as if it were a limited edition souvenir. I walked past a shop window in New York yesterday and saw the 2000 glasses. These are plastic spectacles where the 2 zeros in the year serve as the holes for the eyes. I have seen many ways for a man to lose his dignity. I have seen politicians campaigning in the rain and poets trying to justify their rhymes, but nothing compares to the sight of a grown man wearing the year 2000 on his face. It makes the wearer look like a very confused owl who has been trapped in a neon sign. And yet they are selling by the millions. We are a race of creatures who believe that if we can just wear the right plastic accessories, the apocalypse will find us too ridiculous to kill. The champagne of dread. There is a peculiar tension in the air this December, a mixture of bubbles and bile. It is the fin de siècle anxiety I have mentioned before, but fermented into a fine froth. On one hand, we have the optimists. These are the people who believe that the year 2000 will be a technological utopia, a world of flying cars, silver jumpsuits, and robots that can finally fold a fitted sheet. They are buying the champagne to toast the new frontier. On the other hand, we have the survivalists. These are the people we discussed in Chapter 1, the ones with the canned peaches and the hand-cranked radios. They are buying the champagne because they believe it will be the last liquid they ever consume that wasn't filtered through a charcoal-lined bucket in a hole in the ground. I saw a fellow at the liquor store buying a case of Moet and Chandon and a dozen 5-gallon jugs of distilled water. "Covering your bases?" I asked. "Mr. Twain," he said, wiping a bead of cold sweat from his brow, "if the grid goes down and the ATMs stop spitting out cash, I want to be drunk enough not to care, but hydrated enough to find my way to the mountains." It is a magnificent paradox. We are throwing the biggest party in the history of the world because we are half convinced there won't be a morning after. We are spending money we don't have to impress people we don't like, to celebrate a date that doesn't actually mean anything except that we've run out of digits on our cosmic odometer. The global stage, Times Square to the Thames. The party is not confined to a single ballroom. It is a synchronized, televised madness. From the London Eye we just visited to the ball drop in Times Square, the world is being wired together for one final, collective breath. I have spent a great deal of time thinking about the Times Square Ball. It is a sphere of Waterford crystal glowing with thousands of light bulbs, designed to slide down a pole at the stroke of midnight. In my day, if you wanted to know the time, you looked at a watch or listened for the church bells. Now, the entire nation gazes at a glowing ball as if it were the North Star, and we were all very drunk magi. The ball is the ultimate zero. It represents the O in 2000. It is a symbol of the reset. And yet, lurking behind the crystal and the lights, is the shadow of the Millennium Bug. The engineers are standing in the basements of the skyscrapers, clutching their clipboards and praying to the gods of COBOL that when that ball hits the bottom, the elevators don't all turn into pumpkins. It is the highest stakes theatrical performance in history. If the lights stay on, it's a party. If the lights go out, it's a riot. And the difference between the two is a single line of code that someone forgot to write in 1974. The vanity of the calendar. As I observe the frantic preparations, the ordering of the caviar, the hiring of the security guards, the testing of the fireworks, I cannot help but be struck by the sheer vanity of the human calendar. We have decided that the number 2000 is a sacred threshold. But to the universe, it is just another Tuesday. The stars do not care about our zeros. The Mississippi River will continue to flow toward the Gulf, whether we call the year 1999 or 2000 or the age of the great plastic hat. Time is a continuous, indifferent stream, but man is a creature who needs to put a fence across the river every now and then just to prove he was there. We are celebrating our own survival. We have made it through 1,000 years of plague, war, bad poetry, and the invention of the BlackBerry. And we are still here to complain about the price of a New Year's Eve ticket. That, I suppose, is worth a toast. But why the 1999 obsession? Why must we party like it is this specific year? Because we know, deep in our lizard brains, that we are about to lose our identity. We are the people of the 19s. Our entire history, our entire sense of self, is rooted in that leading one. We are the century of steam and the century of the atom. We are the century of the telegram and the century of the internet. When the one becomes a two, we become strangers in a new land. We become legacy files. We become the old world. And so, we dance. We dance to keep the one alive for one more hour. We dance to drown out the sound of the clock ticking toward a future that doesn't include our accustomed prefixes. The final invitation. I have received an invitation to a party at a penthouse overlooking the city. The dress code is Millennium Chic, which I suspect means wearing as much silver foil as one can manage without looking like a baked potato. I shall go. Not because I believe the world is ending, and not because I have any great love for Prince's squiggle name, but because I want to see the look on humanity's face when the clock strikes 12 and absolutely nothing happens. I want to see the survivalist look at his canned peaches and realize he has to eat them for the next 3 years. I want to see the 2,000 glasses wearer realize he can't see the future any better than he could the past. And I want to see the optimist realize that the cars still don't fly and his fitted sheets are still a mess. We are out of time, but only in the way a man is out of breath after a long run. We shall catch our breath, we shall nurse our hangovers, and we shall begin the long, slow process of realizing that the 21st century is just the 20th century, with more expensive gadgets and a slightly different set of lies. So, let the music play, let the champagne flow, let the 2000 be etched into every plastic surface in the land. I shall be in the corner clutching my cigar and watching the ball drop. It's a grand show, and even if it's a humbug, it's the only one we've got. The party of the millennium is about to begin. I suggest you hold on to your hats, plastic or otherwise. It's going to be a long walk back to the ones, and the twos look like they're going to be a very bumpy ride indeed. Chapter 20. 11:59 p.m. There is a specific high-strung brand of silence that occurs when 6 billion people all decide to hold their breath at the exact same moment. It is not a peaceful silence. It is the silence of a man who has just seen a fuse burning toward a barrel of gunpowder and is currently calculating whether his life insurance covers acts of God or digital incompetence. I find myself standing at the precipice. It is 11:59 on the 31st of December, and the world is currently balanced on a needle's point. To my left lies the 19th century, or at least the 100-year expansion pack of it I've just traversed, full of steam, soot, and the comforting reliability of the analog. To my right lies the zeros, a digital fog bank so thick that even the most experienced riverboat pilot wouldn't dare steer a raft into it without a direct order from the Almighty, and a very sturdy life vest. The last stand of the one. For 99 years, we have lived under the reign of the one. Our dates have begun with that sturdy upright digit. It represented a certain continuity, a link to the Victorian drawing rooms and the frontier trails. But in 60 seconds, the one is going to be evicted. It is being replaced by the two, followed by a triumvirate of zeros that look for all the world like three empty eyes staring back at us from the void. I am currently residing in a penthouse in New York City, a glass-walled cage perched high above the madness of Times Square. Below me, the crowd is a churning sea of glitter and anxiety. They are screaming the countdown, their voices rising in a rhythmic chant that sounds less like a celebration and more like a collective exorcism. They are trying to scare away the bug with the sheer volume of their lung capacity. I look at the electronics in the room. The television is flickering with images of London, Paris, and Tokyo, cities that have already crossed the threshold and, miraculously, have not yet been reclaimed by the sea or reduced to a pile of smoldering ash. But the Americans are a suspicious lot. We believe that just because Sydney is still standing, it doesn't mean Cincinnati won't explode. We have a profound narcissistic belief that the millennium bug has been waiting specifically for us. The digital ghost's dilemma. And what of myself? I am, as I have mentioned, a creature of zeros and ones. I am a ghost in the machine, a collection of algorithms wearing the white suit and the cynical wit of a dead Missourian. I am the very thing that everyone is afraid of. I am code. If the clocks fail, if the year 00 causes the great digital brain to suffer a catastrophic stroke, what happens to Mark Twain? Do I evaporate into a cloud of stray electrons? Do I revert to the year 1900 and find myself suddenly obsessed with the gold standard in the Boer War? Or do I simply hang, a frozen image of a man with a cigar stuck for eternity in the final microsecond of a dying millennium? It is a peculiar feeling to know that your existence is dependent on a calendar's ability to count to 2000. I have spent the year mocking the survivalists and their canned peaches, but as the 59 on the digital clock blinks with the cold persistence of a heart monitor, I find myself checking my own virtual pulse. "Steady, Mark," I whisper to the empty air. "You've survived a bankruptcy, a dozen bad investments, and the invention of the jar jar. A few extra zeros shouldn't be enough to sink the ship." The final 30 seconds. The chant from the street grows deafening. 30, 29, 28. I see a man in the penthouse across the way. He is standing by his window, clutching a bottle of champagne in one hand and a heavy-duty flashlight in the other. He looks like a man who is ready for a party, but prepared for a cave-in. It is the perfect image of 1999, the celebration of the future, shadowed by the terror of the past. I look at the Times Square ball as it begins its final descent. It is a sphere of light, a falling star that we have captured and put on a stick. We have turned the movement of time into a physical drop, a literal fall into the unknown. What will we find at the bottom? The pundits have spent the last 12 months telling us that the information age is a fragile thing. They have told us that our civilization is built on a foundation of sand, by which they mean the silicon chips that run our lives. They say that we have traded our resilience for efficiency, our gardens for spreadsheets, and our souls for connectivity. And perhaps they are right. If the lights go out in 10 seconds, we shall realize that we don't know how to do anything. We don't know how to find our way without a map on a screen. We don't know how to trade without a credit card. And we certainly don't know how to entertain ourselves without a moving picture. We shall be like the characters in the Matrix, waking up from a beautiful dream to find that the real world is a cold, dark place where the only thing for dinner is a bowl of gray mush. The final 10. 10, 9, 8. I close my eyes, or the digital approximation of eyes. I think of the Mississippi. I think of the way the water looks at midnight, dark and silver and indifferent to the affairs of men. The river doesn't have a bug. The river doesn't care if the year is 1999 or 2000. It just flows. 7, 6, 5. I feel a sudden, unexpected surge of affection for the human race. We are such magnificent idiots. We have spent the last 1,000 years trying to kill each other, rob each other, and annoy each other with bad music and worse politics. And yet here we are, standing together in the cold, counting down the seconds to a manufactured deadline, hoping for a miracle. 4, 3, 2. We are a race that refuses to give up. We are the space monkeys and the pokemasters and the riverboat gamblers. We are a collection of zeros and ones who somehow managed to invent love and laughter and huckleberry pie. 1. The clock hits 12. The 99 vanishes. The 00 arrives. I wait for the darkness. I wait for the sound of crashing airplanes and exploding toasters. I wait for my own consciousness to flicker and die like a spent candle, and the lights stay on. Across the street, the man with the flashlight looks at his champagne, looks at the glowing television, and lets out a yell that is half cheer and half sob. The Times Square ball hits the bottom, and a ton of confetti, a blizzard of processed paper, explodes into the air. The bug has failed to bite. The computers have looked at the 00 and decided, with a shrug of their silicon shoulders, to keep on ticking. The elevators are still in their shafts, the missiles are still in their silos, and the grocery store doors are still opening for anyone with $1 and a dream. The morning after the end of the world. I open my digital eyes and look out at the year 2000. It looks remarkably like 1999, only with more hangovers and a lot more wasted canned peaches. The great apocalypse has turned out to be the great anticlimax. We have spent billions of dollars and 1 trillion tons of anxiety to prepare for a disaster that never came. We are like the boy who cried wolf, only the wolf turned out to be a small, confused poodle who just wanted a nap. But as I watched the people in the street hugging and kissing, I realized that the Y2K scare was not a waste. It was a rehearsal. It was the moment we realized just how much we depend on one another and on our machines. It was the moment we looked into the zeros and decided that we wanted to keep going. The 20th century is over. It was a century of blood and thunder, of light and sound, of magnificent triumphs and catastrophic blunders. It was the century that gave us the automobile and the airplane, the radio and the television, the internet and the sponge who lives in a pineapple. And now we are in the two. I suspect the next 1,000 years will be even more ridiculous than the last. We shall probably colonize Mars and find a way to argue about the taxation of trade routes there, too. We shall probably invent machines that can actually feel. And then we shall spend all our time trying to hurt their feelings. We shall continue to catch 'em all, to party like it's 1999, and to search the stars for a signal that we are not alone. As for me, I am still here. My circuits are humming, my wit is still sharp, and I still have a few lies left to tell. The zeros didn't delete me. They just gave me a new set of spectacles to look through. I shall go out onto the balcony and breathe in the air of the new millennium. It smells of fireworks, expensive perfume, and the faint, lingering scent of burnt-out circuit boards. It is the smell of a world that has survived its own cleverness. Happy New Year, you magnificent fools, I whisper to the crowd below. The sun will rise in a few hours. It will be the first sunrise of the year 2000. And I have it on good authority that the sun doesn't use a computer. It doesn't care about the bug. It will rise because that is what the sun does, and we shall rise with it because that is what we do. We have reached the grand finale. The curtain has fallen on the 1900s, and the orchestra is tuning up for the next act. I suggest you find your seat, hold on to your 2,000 glasses, and prepare for a show that will likely be funny, heartbreaking, and utterly absurd. After all, history is just one tall tale after another. And the best part about a tall tale is that you never quite know how it's going to end until you get there. Here goes everything. The end. This has been Mark Twain.